Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live half buried in the earth, watching winter swallow the world above you? Imagine a place where the sky disappears for months at a time, where silence becomes so complete you can hear the frost forming on wood, where survival means descending into darkness rather than reaching toward light. Tonight, we journey to the frozen Siberian frontier of the late 1700s and early 1800s, a landscape so remote, so unforgiving, that settlers carved their homes partly beneath the ground just to survive. These were not temporary shelters or primitive caves, but deliberate architectural choices born from necessity, ingenuity, and a resignation to the brutal rhythms of winter. Before we descend into this quiet world of snow and earthen walls, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoy these slow journeys through forgotten corners of history, please tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History. It helps us continue exploring these hidden passages together. Leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is in your world right now. Perhaps you're wrapped in the stillness of deep night, or maybe dawn is just breaking, or you find yourself somewhere in that liminal space between. Dim your lights if you can, perhaps let a fan hum softly in the background, and prepare yourself for a gentle descent, not just into the ground, but into a way of life that has been almost entirely forgotten. Let us begin. You wake in darkness, not the darkness of a room without windows, but the darkness of earth pressing close on every side, the darkness of a home built as much below ground as above it. The air is cold, so cold that breathing deeply sends a sharp ache through your chest. You lie still for a moment, wrapped in whatever layers of wool and fur you managed to gather before sleep took you. And you listen to the silence. It is a silence unlike any you knew before coming to this place. The snow outside your zemlyanka, your half-buried log dwelling, has muffled the world so completely that you might as well be entombed. Even the usual sounds of winter wind do not reach you here, 2 feet beneath the surface. The earth itself absorbs everything, voices, footsteps, even your own thoughts seem to sink into the packed soil walls. You know it is morning only because your body tells you so. There is no light to confirm it, just a faint greyness filtering through the tiny smoke hole in your roof, a hole barely wider than your fist. Frost has formed on the inside of the logs during the night. You can see it in the dim glow of dying embers from your hearth. Delicate crystals spreading across the wood like intricate lacework, beautiful and hostile all at once. Your fingers ache before you even move them. The cold has settled into your joints overnight, a dull, persistent pressure that you have learned never truly leaves during the winter months. You must revive the fire first. Everything depends on the fire. The embers glow weakly beneath a layer of ash, and you reach for the birch bark you saved yesterday, your movements slow and deliberate. Coaxing flame from nearly dead coals is a skill you have practiced 10,000 times. You blow gently, steadily, watching the orange glow brighten and fade, until finally a small flame catches. The fire grows, but it will be another hour before the room warms enough to make breathing comfortable. For now, you simply accept the cold as you accept the earth walls around you. It is part of the structure of your existence here. Your dwelling is perhaps 12 feet across at its widest point. The walls are logs chinked with moss and clay, and beyond them, packed earth rises up on all sides. The roof is low. You cannot stand fully upright except in the very center. It is made of smaller logs laid across larger beams, then covered with birch bark, then sod, then snow. From the outside, your home is almost invisible, just a gentle mound in the landscape, a soft swelling in the snow, with smoke occasionally rising from its center. A stranger might walk past without noticing anything at all. This is intentional, of course. The earth walls hold heat far better than wood alone ever could, and the snow that accumulates on your roof becomes another layer of insulation. But it is also psychologically oppressive in ways you could not have anticipated. Living underground changes something in your relationship with time, with space, with the very sensation of being alive. The darkness is constant. Even at midday, when the sun is theoretically highest, only a weak grey light penetrates your dwelling. You have learned to do most tasks by feel rather than sight. Preparing food, mending clothes, sorting through stored goods, all of this happens in a perpetual twilight that makes hours feel like days and days feel like weeks. The smell is another constant. Damp earth, wood smoke, unwashed wool, the metallic scent of cold that seems to have no source but is always present. Your nose stopped registering these smells as distinct weeks ago. Now they are simply the smell of home. Your family shares this space, your wife, your 2 children, your aging mother. 5 people in a room the size of a modest merchant storeroom. Privacy does not exist here. You sleep within arm's reach of each other. You eat from the same pot. You share the same air, the same darkness, the same cold. When someone is ill, everyone knows it immediately. When someone is angry or sad, there is nowhere to retreat, no door to close, no separate room to offer solitude. You have learned to read emotions through the smallest signs, the particular silence that means resentment, the subtle shift in breathing that signals anxiety, the way someone's hands move differently when they are afraid. This intimacy is both survival and burden. Outside, the world is white beyond measure. Snow covers everything to a depth that reaches your waist in places, deeper where it has drifted against the trees. The forest stretches endlessly in all directions, birch and pine and larch rising like dark pillars from the white ground, their branches heavy with accumulated snow that occasionally falls with soft, startling impacts. You have learned not to flinch at these sounds. Your settlement, if it can be called that, consists of perhaps 6 families scattered across a distance of several miles. Each family has carved their own zemlyanka into a hillside or riverbank, each choosing a location based on proximity to water and timber. And there is a shared well dug deep and lined with logs to prevent collapse. In summer, it provides cold, clean water. In winter, it becomes a focal point of daily struggle. Every morning you must make the walk to this well. The path is worn into the snow by repeated passage, but each night new snow falls and obscures it slightly, so you must pay attention to the landmarks. A particular tree, a bent sapling, a large stone. The temperature is often 40 degrees below zero. At this temperature, the cold is not merely uncomfortable, it is a physical presence, an aggressive force that attacks any exposed skin within seconds. You wrap your face with wool cloth until only your eyes remain visible. Even so, your eyelashes collect frost, and if you are not careful, your breath will freeze in your beard and create a mask of ice around your mouth. The snow crunches beneath your feet with a particular sound, crisp and squeaking, a sound that only happens at these extreme temperatures. It is oddly pleasant, this sound, a small sensory gift in an otherwise hostile environment. At the well, you must first break through the surface ice that has formed overnight. You keep an iron rod for this purpose, driving it down repeatedly until you hear the change in tone that tells you you have broken through. Then you lower the wooden bucket on its rope carefully, because if you drop the bucket and lose it down the well, retrieving it will be nearly impossible. The rope is stiff with cold and hard to grip. When you pull the bucket up, water sloshes over the sides and freezes almost instantly on your gloves. Your fingers begin to lose feeling within minutes, despite the thick wool and leather wrapping them. You pour the water into the larger wooden buckets you brought with you, 2 buckets, 1 for each hand, to balance the load. The water is so cold it steams in the air, creating brief clouds that vanish almost as quickly as they form. The walk back to your zemlyanka takes perhaps 15 minutes. It feels longer because of the wait, because of the cold, because of the monotony of having done this same walk every single day for months. Your shoulders ache. Your back aches. Your fingers have gone from painful to numb, which is almost worse because numbness is the warning sign before frostbite sets in. Inside the zemlyanka again, you set the buckets down carefully. Some of the water will be used for cooking, some for drinking, some kept for washing, though in deep winter, washing is more theoretical than actual. You hold your hands close to the fire, but not too close. You have learned that warming frozen fingers too quickly brings excruciating pain. You let the heat reach them gradually, watching as feeling returns in stages, first as tingling, then as a deep ache, then finally as something approaching normal sensation. Your wife has begun preparing the morning meal. Breakfast is simple, a thin porridge made from stored grain, perhaps a piece of dried fish if you are fortunate. Black bread, so hard it must be softened in hot water before you can chew it. The grain you use for porridge comes from your underground storage pit, a deeper chamber dug beneath the floor of your main room. Down there the temperature remains just above freezing year-round, cold enough to preserve food, but not so cold as to freeze it solid. Climbing down into this storage pit is always slightly unnerving. The ladder is rough-hewn and slippery with condensation, and the chamber itself is completely dark, requiring you to work by feel, alone. You keep your stores organized carefully, grain in bark containers to keep out moisture, root vegetables piled in corners, dried fish hanging from pegs driven into the earthen walls, preserved berries in clay pots sealed with animal fat. Everything must last until spring, which feels impossibly distant. The root vegetables, turnips, beets, carrots, all taste strongly of earth no matter how carefully you brush them clean. This earthiness is not unpleasant exactly, but it is inescapable, a reminder that you are living in and of the soil. Your children help with food preparation when they can. Your daughter, 7 years old, knows how to sort through dried berries and remove any that show signs of mold. Your son, barely 5, is learning to split kindling with a small hatchet under careful supervision. He is too young to understand that his entire childhood is being spent underground, that other children in other places play in gardens with sunshine and flowers. To him, this is simply how life is. The darkness, the cold, the endless repetition. These are not hardships, but normal conditions, and you are grateful for his resilience, even as you mourn what he has never known. After the morning meal, there is the question of the animals. You keep 2 goats, and, if fortune has been with you, a cow, though maintaining a cow through a Siberian winter is an enormous challenge. The animals live in a separate structure, though separate is a generous term. It is another earthen chamber dug into the hillside, connected to your main dwelling by a short, covered passage, so you need not go outside to tend them. This arrangement serves multiple purposes. The animals' body heat contributes to warming your living space. You can care for them without facing the full brutality of outdoor temperatures, and they are protected from wolves and other predators that grow desperate in deep winter. The architectural logic is sound, even if the result is a dwelling that smells perpetually of livestock. When you enter the animal chamber, your eyes adjust to an even dimmer light than your main room. The goats shift and make their soft bleating sounds, clouds of breath visible in the cold air. The cow, if she survived this long into winter, stands with her characteristic patience, her large dark eyes reflecting the tiny amount of light that filters through cracks. She is gaunt. They are all gaunt by this point in the season, but still alive, still providing small amounts of milk that supplement your diet in ways you cannot afford to lose. You scrape away soiled straw from the floor and replace it with fresh material from your dwindling supply. The smell of manure mixes with the smell of hay and animal warmth, creating a particular atmosphere that is somehow both unpleasant and comforting. These creatures depend entirely on you for their survival, and you depend equally on them. Without their milk, their eventual meat, their hides and bones, you could not make it through winter. You carry hay to them, dry grass cut and stored during the brief summer months when the meadows briefly became accessible. The animals eat slowly, methodically, and you watch them for signs of illness or weakness. A sick animal in winter can mean the difference between survival and starvation. You have learned to notice subtle changes, the angle of an ear, the brightness of an eye, the rhythm of chewing. When you milk the goats, your fingers are still cold despite the fire's gradual warming of your main room. The milk comes in thin streams, less than there would be in summer, but enough. You carry the wooden bowl of milk carefully back through the connecting passage. Your wife will use some of it immediately, will save some for the children, will let some sit to separate so the cream can be skimmed and churned into butter. A laborious process in cold temperatures, but one that yields precious fat. By mid-morning, though morning is an arbitrary designation in a world without clear sunlight, you must turn your attention to the most pressing concern of all: firewood. The fire cannot go out, must never go out, because restarting it in deep cold with damp tinder is a miserable, sometimes impossible task. You need firewood constantly. The fire consumes wood at a rate that would astonish someone unfamiliar with this climate, several armloads per day, every day without exception. Your woodpile, stacked outside and covered with bark and snow, seems to shrink visibly despite your careful rationing. You know you must venture into the forest regularly to replenish it, a task that fills you with a particular kind of weary determination. You prepare for wood gathering with the same ritualistic care you give to everything in winter: layers of clothing, face wrappings, mittens over gloves, felt boots wrapped with strips of hide. Every piece of clothing is essential. Missing even one layer could lead to dangerous exposure. Your axe is kept inside near the fire so the metal stays relatively warm and your hands do not stick to it. You take also a rope for dragging logs, a small amount of dried meat for energy, and flint in case disaster strikes and you need to make an emergency fire. Outside, the cold hits you like a physical blow. No matter how many times you experience it, this initial shock of temperature never diminishes. The sensation that the air itself is hostile, that breathing too deeply will damage your lungs. You stand for a moment, letting your body adjust, your eyes scanning the landscape. The forest beckons with its dark columns of trees and you begin walking toward it, following paths you have memorized through repeated use. The snow is deeper here, away from the compacted areas near your dwelling. Each step requires lifting your foot high, pushing through resistance, setting it down carefully to avoid invisible hollows where you might sink to your thigh. The trees, when you reach them, stand in their winter stillness, each branch laden with snow that has accumulated over weeks. Finding good deadwood, dry enough to burn efficiently, but not so rotten it crumbles, requires experience and patience. You identify a fallen pine, its trunk perhaps 8 inches in diameter, lying partially buried. You clear away snow with your mittened hands, assessing whether it is worth the effort of cutting and hauling. The wood seems sound and you begin the work of cutting it into manageable sections. Your axe bites into the frozen wood with dull impacts that barely echo in the snow-muffled forest. Each swing of the axe requires energy you can barely afford to expend. Your breath comes harder and you feel sweat beginning beneath your layers of clothing. Dangerous because sweat that freezes can kill you once you stop moving. You pace yourself, striking rhythmically but not frantically, letting the weight of the axe do much of the work. Cut, swing, a meditation of sorts. The repetition creating a space where thoughts can drift. You think about summer sometimes while doing this work. The distant memory of warmth, of being able to move without layers, of seeing green things growing from soil instead of endless white. These memories feel increasingly unreal, like stories someone told you rather than experiences you actually lived. When you have cut several pieces of manageable size, you rope them together and begin dragging them back toward your zemlyanka. The sled you might have used is broken, awaiting repair, so you must drag the logs directly through snow. The weight is substantial, and your back protests immediately. You lean into the work, pulling steadily, stopping occasionally to rest and to ensure you are still following the correct path. Getting lost in these forests is always possible despite your familiarity. The snow changes the landscape subtly with each fall, and whiteout conditions can arise suddenly, erasing all landmarks within minutes. You navigate partly by memory, partly by the weak position of the sun when you can detect it through the overcast sky, partly by instinct developed through repetition. Each journey out and back successfully completed feels like a small victory. Back at your zemlyanka, you stack the new wood near your entrance, then carry several pieces inside to dry near the fire. Wet wood burns inefficiently, filling your dwelling with smoke, so you have learned to rotate pieces constantly, drying some while burning others. The afternoon passes in tasks that vary little from day to day. Your wife works at her loom if there is enough light, weaving the rough cloth you will need for repairs and replacements. The sound of the loom is oddly soothing, the rhythmic thump and slide, a human-made sound in a season of silence. She weaves by feel as much as by sight, her fingers following patterns she learned as a girl. Your mother, elderly and increasingly frail, sits close to the fire and works on whatever small tasks her arthritic hands can still manage. Sometimes she shells dried peas from their pods, sometimes she sorts wool for spinning, sometimes she simply sits and remembers. She talks occasionally of her childhood in a village that seems impossibly distant now, a place with churches and markets, with neighbors whose houses were above ground, with seasons that actually changed in predictable ways. You listen to these stories with divided attention, both grateful for the connection to a larger world and resentful that such a world remains forever out of your reach. Your children create their own games in the limited space. They build small structures from wood scraps. They tell each other stories borrowed from their grandmother's memories. They argue and reconcile in the compressed space. Sometimes they go outside to play, but in deep winter these excursions are brief, 10 minutes, 15 at most, before the cold drives them back underground. You watch them tumble back through the entrance, cheeks flushed with cold, eyes bright, their brief taste of open air already fading. Evening comes early and is almost indistinguishable from afternoon. The quality of darkness changes slightly, becoming, if possible, even more complete. You light a small oil lamp, precious oil made from fish carefully rationed, for an hour or two if you can afford it. The flame creates shadows that dance across the earthen walls, making the space feel alternately larger and smaller than it actually is. The evening meal is similar to breakfast: porridge or thin stew, bread if you still have it, occasionally some preserved meat. You eat slowly, partly to savor the food, and partly because eating slowly makes it feel like there is more. Conversation happens in low voices, not because you need to be quiet, but because loud voices feel somehow wrong in this muffled space. You talk about practical matters, how much firewood remains, whether the goats need more attention, which tools need repair before they break completely. Your wife mentions that your daughter's boots are wearing through and will need patching soon. Your son demonstrates how he can count to 20 now, a skill his grandmother has been teaching him during the long, dark afternoons. After eating, there is little to do but sit near the fire and wait, for sleep. This is perhaps the hardest part of the day. These hours when work is done but sleep has not yet arrived, when you are left alone with thoughts that have nowhere productive to go. You think about the spring that will eventually come, though it seems impossible to believe in it fully. You think about the crops you will plant, the repairs you will make to your dwelling, the possibility of hunting fresh meat again. But spring feels more like a myth than a promise, something people claim exists but which you have no real evidence for. The winter has already lasted so long that it feels permanent, a fundamental condition of existence rather than a season that will pass. The fire burns lower. You add another piece of wood, watching the flames catch and grow, feeling the temporary increase in warmth against your face. Your children fall asleep first, curled together under their shared pile of furs and blankets. Their breathing becomes slow and regular, and you envy their ability to escape consciousness so completely. Your mother sleeps next, her snoring loud in the enclosed space. Your wife and you remain awake a while longer, not talking, simply existing in proximity. Eventually, you bank the fire carefully, covering the burning logs with ash to make them burn more slowly through the night, and you lie down in your own nest of bedding. The ground beneath you is hard, despite the layers of straw and cloth between your body and the packed earth floor. The cold begins creeping in immediately as the fire dies down. You pull the furs and blankets closer, but you know from experience that by morning you will wake cold no matter how carefully you prepare. You lie in the darkness and listen to the silence. Sometimes you hear snow sliding from the roof with a soft whisper. Sometimes you hear timbers creaking as they contract in the cold. Sometimes you hear nothing at all except the blood in your own ears. Sleep comes eventually, though not deeply. You remain partially aware throughout the night, monitoring the fire's status, listening for problems, ready to wake fully if needed. And then, eventually, you wake again in darkness. Not the darkness of a room without windows, but the darkness of earth, pressing close on every side. The air is cold, so cold that breathing deeply sends a sharp ache through your chest. You lie still for a moment, and you know without checking that it is morning only because your body tells you so. The rhythm of your days continues, each one nearly identical to the last, each one requiring the same tasks performed in the same order with the same weary determination. This is what it means to be a frontier settler in the Siberian winter of the early 1800s. Not adventure, not glory, not even particularly memorable suffering, just repetition, just cold, just the quiet struggle to remain alive until the possibility of warmth returns, if it returns, if the spring that everyone promises actually exists somewhere beyond this endless, white silence. Let us turn now from the general rhythm of settlement life to a single thread within that larger fabric, the story of one woman whose existence illuminates what these bare facts of survival actually meant when lived through a particular consciousness, in a particular body, across the span of years that transform a child into an elder. Maria Sidorovna was born in 1789 in a small village near Kazan, a place where the Volga River bent through farmland that had known cultivation for centuries. Her earliest memories were not of snow but of dust, the golden dust of late summer hanging in afternoon light as her father worked their modest plot of land. Her family was neither wealthy nor entirely destitute. They occupied that uncertain middle ground where survival was achieved through constant labor, but catastrophe was always one bad harvest away. Her father, Sidor Mikhailovich, was a peasant who worked land owned by a minor nobleman. He paid his obligations in grain and in labor, and for years this arrangement functioned adequately, if not comfortably. But in 1796, when Maria was 7 years old, a combination of poor harvest and disputed measurements led to accusations that her father had withheld grain owed to his landlord. Whether these accusations were true or false became irrelevant once they were made. The machinery of consequence began turning regardless. The family fell into debt. Not the sort of debt that could be resolved through a good harvest and careful economy, but the deepening kind that accumulated interest and penalties until the original amount owed became almost incidental. Maria's father tried to argue his case before the landlord's steward. She remembers watching him prepare for this meeting, rehearsing his words, trying to present their situation in terms that might generate mercy rather than further punishment. He returned from that meeting walking differently, shoulders bent in a way they had not been bent before. The steward had been unmoved and, worse, had noted her father's arguments as resistance to authority. Within months, the solution arrived in the form of a government decree that had been circulating through the region. The Siberian territories needed settlers, workers who would establish agricultural communities in the vast, underpopulated frontier lands. Families in debt, families in legal difficulty, families without prospects, all were being offered what was officially termed an opportunity. Unofficially, everyone understood it as a gentler form of exile, a way to rid European Russia of its problematic populations while simultaneously developing its eastern possessions. Maria's family was given a choice that was not really a choice: relocate to Siberia with a modest resettlement allowance and the promise of land, or face the consequences of their accumulated debts through other means. Her father chose Siberia, though chose is perhaps too strong a word for what was essentially acceptance of the least destructive option available. The journey east took months. They travelled in a caravan of similarly displaced families, moving slowly along roads that deteriorated the further they travelled from established settlements. Maria, at 7 years old, found the journey initially exciting. She had never been more than a few miles from her home village, and the changing landscapes, forests giving way to plains, rivers growing wider, settlements becoming sparser, had the quality of adventure. But excitement faded as the journey extended week after week. The novelty of sleeping in wagons and eating around communal fires was replaced by a grinding tedium punctuated by occasional incidents: a wagon wheel breaking, a child falling ill, disputes between families over supplies or space. Her mother grew quieter as they travelled, speaking less each day. Maria did not understand then what she would comprehend only later: that her mother was mourning not just the loss of their home, but the death of all the futures she had imagined for her children. They arrived at their designated settlement location in late autumn of 1797. The place had no name that Maria ever learned. It was simply referred to by its administrative designation, a combination of letters and numbers that meant nothing to anyone who lived there. What they found was not a village, but a scattering of rough shelters along a riverbank, surrounded by forest that stretched unbroken to every horizon. A few families had arrived before them, and a few more would arrive after, but the settlement would never grow beyond 12 or 15 households. The first winter was the hardest because they faced it in structures that were barely adequate. Her family's initial zemlyanka was dug hastily, without the refinements that experience would later teach them. Water seeped through the earthen walls, the roof logs were not properly sealed, allowing cold air to pour through gaps. The smoke hole was positioned badly, causing the hearth smoke to pool in their living space rather than venting efficiently. Maria remembers the constant burning in her eyes that winter, the way every morning began with tears streaming down her face from the accumulated smoke. She remembers hunger, not the acute starvation of famine, but the chronic, grinding hunger of insufficient food stretched across too many mouths. They had brought supplies for the journey and the initial settlement period, but these ran low before local food production could adequately replace them. Her father spent that first winter in a state of barely controlled desperation. He had been promised agricultural land, but the land here was not like the cultivated soil of their home region. It was barely cleared forest, full of roots and rocks requiring enormous labor before it could support crops. Moreover, the growing season this far north was dramatically shorter than what he had known. Crops that matured reliably in Kazan would not ripen here before the frost returned. He had to learn new techniques, new crop varieties, new timing, all while trying to keep his family alive through a winter longer and colder than any he had experienced in his previous life. Maria watched her father age years in those months, watched his hands become gnarled and permanently damaged from work in extreme cold, watched his voice lose its authority and take on a tone of ongoing defeat. Her mother adapted differently. She became intensely practical, focusing on immediate tasks with an almost meditative concentration. She organized their underground home with meticulous care. She developed systems for managing their food supplies, for rotating their limited clothing so that wear was distributed evenly, for maintaining the small rituals, prayers before meals, songs before sleep, that created a sense of continuity with their lost previous life. Maria learned from both parents in different ways. From her father, she learned determination in the face of obvious futility, the ability to keep working even when success seemed impossible. From her mother, she learned the practical domestic knowledge that would become the foundation of her survival: how to judge the quality of preserved food, how to patch clothing so the repair was nearly invisible, how to manage fire and smoke and limited light, how to create the appearance of order, even in circumstances fundamentally characterized by chaos. These were not skills taught through formal instruction, but absorbed through daily observation and participation. By age 10, Maria was performing many of the tasks that would define her adult life. She hauled water from the river, breaking through surface ice with the particular technique required, not striking straight down, which could crack the ice dangerously far, but chipping in circular patterns to create a hole without destabilizing the surrounding surface. She learned to tend the family's goats, understanding their needs and moods with an intuitive sense developed through constant proximity. She learned which wild plants could supplement their diet during the brief summer months and which were dangerous despite their appealing appearance. She learned to recognize the signs of coming weather, the particular quality of light before a snowstorm, the behavior of birds before a severe temperature drop, the sound wind made through different types of trees depending on the moisture in the air. These were life-saving skills, not merely interesting observations, because being caught unprepared by weather changes could mean death. But Maria also maintained an inner life that was not entirely consumed by survival. She was drawn to stories, the stories her grandmother told before she died during that first winter, the stories traders occasionally brought when they passed through seeking furs, the stories she created herself in the long, dark afternoons when there was nothing to do but sit and wait for spring. She imagined other places with an intensity that was almost painful. She pictured cities with stone churches and paved streets, marketplaces filled with goods she had never seen, people whose entire lives were spent without ever experiencing the particular suffocation of living underground through a 6-month winter. These imaginings were not really about escape. Even as a child, she understood that her circumstances were permanent, but about maintaining some sense that the world contained more than what her daily life showed her. They were a form of resistance against the narrowing of possibility that frontier life imposed. When Maria was 13, her father died. It was not dramatic. He simply failed to wake one morning, his body having finally exhausted its capacity to continue. The timing was particularly cruel because it happened in early spring, just as the worst of winter was releasing its hold. He died on the edge of a season he would have enjoyed, his death demonstrating that survival was not just a matter of making it through winter, but of maintaining life force across the accumulated damage of multiple winters. His death changed Maria's position in the family fundamentally. At 13, she became the primary laborer, responsible for the tasks her father had performed. She learned to use an axe effectively, though her smaller size meant she tired more quickly. She learned to negotiate with neighboring families for shared labor during crucial periods like harvest or major repairs. She learned the peculiar social dynamics of a tiny, isolated settlement where everyone depended on everyone else but also competed for the same limited resources. Maintaining good relationships with neighbors was essential for survival, yet those same neighbors would not hesitate to take advantage of weakness. Her mother, now widowed in perhaps the most isolated and difficult circumstances imaginable, became even more focused on maintaining their household's viability. She made decisions with a cold practicality that sometimes shocked Maria, refusing to share food with a sick neighbor's family because they could not afford the loss, arguing fiercely over boundary disputes, pushing Maria to work beyond the point of exhaustion because the work simply had to be done. Maria understood even then that this hardness was not cruelty, but necessity. Her mother was ensuring their survival through sheer force of will, sacrificing gentleness because gentleness was a luxury they could not afford. The years between 13 and 18 passed in a blur of repetitive labor, interrupted by occasional incidents that broke the monotony. A fire in one family's zemlyanka that killed 2 children and left the parents with burns that never properly healed. A dispute over shared hunting territory that escalated into violence, leaving one man with a permanent limp and creating a tension in the settlement that lasted years. A summer of unusual warmth that allowed crops to flourish beyond expectation, creating a brief, almost giddy sense of prosperity before the next winter returned them to familiar struggle. During these years, Maria slowly became known in the settlement as someone reliable, a person who would complete tasks she agreed to undertake, who could be trusted with borrowed tools or shared responsibilities, who maintained a steadiness of temperament even in difficult circumstances. This reputation, built gradually through countless small interactions, would prove more valuable than any material wealth. When Maria was 18, a man named Pyotr arrived in the settlement. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, a hunter who had spent several years moving between distant settlements and forest camps, living a semi-nomadic existence, tracking fur-bearing animals. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was weathered and scarred, his hands rough beyond what even hard agricultural labor produced, his manner of speaking blunt to the point of rudeness. But he possessed skills the settlement needed, and more importantly, he possessed a kind of competence that suggested he would survive whatever circumstances arose. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was entirely practical. He needed a permanent base rather than constant movement, and he recognized that Maria's established household provided that. She needed a man's labor for the tasks that were simply beyond her physical capacity, and she recognized that Pyotr was more capable than most. They negotiated the terms of their partnership with the directness of people arranging a business transaction, because romance was another luxury that frontier life did not accommodate. They married in a brief ceremony conducted by a traveling priest who passed through the region irregularly. The priest stayed one night, performed 4 marriages and 6 baptisms, then continued to the next settlement. There was no celebration, no feast, no gathering of extended family to mark the occasion. Maria and Pyotr simply combined their households and continued the work of survival, now as partners rather than individuals. The arrangement proved functional. Pyotr spent extended periods away from their zemlyanka, following trap lines through the forest and occasionally traveling to more distant settlements to trade furs. When he returned, he brought meat, furs for trade or personal use, and occasionally goods he had acquired through barter: salt, metal tools, once a small mirror that Maria treasured absurdly. His absences were long enough that Maria continued to operate largely independently, managing their household and land with the same competence she had developed before his arrival. But his presence, when he was there, made certain aspects of life measurably easier. He could fell trees more quickly, could handle heavy labor that would have taken Maria twice as long, could navigate negotiations with authorities or traders from a position of greater social leverage. Their relationship was not characterized by romantic intimacy, but by mutual respect developed through demonstrated competence. They worked well together because they each understood what needed to be done and did it without requiring constant discussion or emotional processing. In 1812, when Maria was 23, the settlement faced what became known locally as the famine winter, though no one ever recorded it in official histories. The previous summer had been unusually cool and wet, preventing crops from ripening properly. The harvest was perhaps 40% of what it should have been. Every family's stores were inadequate before winter even began, and everyone knew that the season ahead would test them in ways previous winters had not. Food rationing began immediately. Meals that were normally insufficient became merely symbolic. A few spoonfuls of grain boiled in water, a scrap of dried fish divided among 4 people, bread that was more bark and moss than flour. Families began making desperate calculations about survival. Some chose to send their older children to other settlements where distant relatives might take them in, gambling that splitting the family would give everyone better odds. Others refused to separate, believing that they would survive together or die together. Maria's household, by then including her mother, Piotr, and herself, chose to stay together, though the decision was tested daily as their food stores dwindled toward nothing. By midwinter, people were eating things that would normally be discarded: leather scraps boiled until they became barely chewable, bark stripped from certain trees and processed into a paste, roots dug from frozen ground with enormous effort for minimal nutritional return. The goats were slaughtered one by one, providing temporary relief but also eliminating future sources of milk. Maria remembers the particular quality of hunger that winter, not just the physical sensation of an empty stomach, but the way it affected thinking, making concentration impossible, turning every thought eventually back to food, regardless of where it started. She remembers dreams filled with elaborate meals that she would wake from with tears on her face. The cruelty of imagined satisfaction followed immediately by actual emptiness. But more than her own suffering, she remembers the social transformation that hunger produced. Families that had cooperated for years began viewing each other with suspicion. Accusations of hoarding were made without evidence. Small thefts occurred, not of valuable items, but of food scraps, small amounts of grain, anything edible. The veneer of civilization, already thin in such circumstances, became almost transparent. People acted in ways they would later be ashamed of, but in the moment, shame was powerless against the overwhelming drive to continue living. Maria herself participated in this transformation, though she tried to maintain some ethical boundaries. When a neighbor family's stores were devastated by rot, a catastrophe that left them facing certain starvation, Maria and Piotr did not help them. They could not help them, not without endangering their own survival, and so they did not. The neighbor family's youngest child died in late winter, and Maria attended the burial with a complicated mixture of grief, guilt, and terrible relief that it had not been her own household that suffered this loss. What made Maria notable during this period was not that she avoided moral compromise, that was impossible, but that she maintained a certain clarity about what was happening. She did not pretend their actions were generous when they were merely self-preserving. She did not create narratives of righteousness to justify their decisions. She simply acknowledged that survival sometimes required hard choices, and that those choices would have to be lived with afterward. This clarity served a practical purpose. It prevented the kind of self-deception that could lead to even worse decisions. By maintaining an honest assessment of their situation and their actions, she helped keep her household focused on realistic strategies rather than desperate gambles. When spring finally arrived, late, grudging, bringing mud and cold rain before any real warmth, the settlement had lost 3 families entirely. 2 had died completely, and 1 had abandoned their land and departed for an unknown destination, presumably hoping to find better circumstances elsewhere. The survivors emerged from their Zemlyanki gaunt and damaged in ways both visible and invisible. Maria weighed perhaps 70 pounds less than she had the previous summer. Her hair had thinned significantly, her teeth had loosened in her gums, her menstrual cycle had stopped entirely, her body having decided that reproduction was not viable under current conditions. These physical markers of extreme privation would take months to recover from, and some effects would prove permanent. But the psychological effects were perhaps more significant. The settlement's social fabric had been torn during the winter, and the rips did not fully mend even when food became available again. Trust, once broken under extreme conditions, proved difficult to restore. People remembered who had refused help, who had been suspected of theft, who had argued over nothing because hunger made everyone irritable. Maria found that she looked at her neighbors differently now, seeing them not as community members, but as potential threats or potential resources depending on circumstances. She disliked this new way of seeing, but could not simply will herself back to her previous innocence. The summer of 1813 was spent in frantic activity, planting crops with what little seed they had saved, foraging for any edible plants, hunting and fishing with renewed intensity, trying to build stores that would prevent another catastrophic winter. The physical labor was enormous, but it was also psychologically welcome because it displaced the need to think too carefully about what they had experienced. Maria worked until her body simply refused to continue, then rested briefly and worked again. The summer became a blur of cultivation, preservation, and preparation. Gradually, very gradually, the settlement began to recover some sense of normalcy. Bodies regained lost weight, though never quite returning to pre-famine condition. Social relationships were renegotiated, some becoming closer through shared trauma, others permanently damaged. Maria found herself part of an informal leadership group, not through any official appointment, but through the natural gravitational pull of competence and steadiness. Other women, particularly younger ones who had survived the famine as children, began coming to her for advice. How to preserve fish most efficiently, how to judge whether stored grain was still safe to eat, how to manage limited resources across a full winter, how to make decisions about rationing when there were no good options. Maria shared what she knew, but she was also honest about the limitations of her knowledge. She told them there were no guarantees, that careful planning could still result in disaster, that survival often came down to factors beyond anyone's control: weather, illness, sheer chance. This honesty, rather than undermining her authority, seemed to strengthen it. People trusted someone who acknowledged uncertainty more than they trusted someone who pretended to have all answers. In 1815, Maria gave birth to her first child, a daughter born in spring when conditions were as favorable as they ever became. The pregnancy had been unexpected, her body having taken years to recover enough fertility to conceive. The birth was difficult, taking place in the dimness of their Zemlyanka, with only her mother and one neighbor woman to assist. For hours, Maria existed in a space beyond normal consciousness, pain and effort blending until she lost track of which was which. But the child survived, and Maria survived, and in the days following the birth, she experienced something she had not felt in years, a kind of hope that was not based on practical calculation, but on simple emotional response to new life. Her daughter, whom she named Ekaterina, represented possibility in a way that nothing else in Maria's life had for a very long time. Raising a child in frontier conditions meant constantly balancing their needs against available resources. Maria nursed Ekaterina as long as possible, partly for nutrition and partly because it delayed the return of her fertility. Another pregnancy, too soon, could be dangerous for both mother and child. She made toys from scraps of wood and cloth. She told stories during the long, dark winters. She tried to create some sense of childhood joy, despite circumstances that were fundamentally hostile to joy. Watching Ekaterina grow, Maria found herself thinking about futures that extended beyond mere survival. Perhaps her daughter would see circumstances improve. Perhaps the settlement would grow into an actual town with amenities and opportunities. Perhaps Ekaterina would not spend her entire life underground, struggling against cold and hunger and endless repetition. These were fragile hopes, easily shattered by realistic assessment, but Maria allowed herself to maintain them anyway. 2 more children followed, a son in 1817 who lived only 6 months before succumbing to winter illness, and another daughter in 1819 who survived and was named Anna. Each pregnancy was a risk, each birth a trial, each infant a mixture of joy and additional burden. Maria's body bore the marks of multiple pregnancies and years of hard labor, her frame permanently altered, her health compromised in ways that became increasingly apparent as she aged. But the children also provided motivation for continued effort, and a sense that her life had meaning beyond simple persistence. Pyotr continued his pattern of extended absences and periodic returns. His hunting and trapping provided essential resources, but his presence in his children's lives was minimal. He was not cruel or neglectful by the standards of their time and place, but he was also not present in ways that created emotional bonds. The children knew him as the person who occasionally appeared with gifts and stories, not as a constant parenting figure. This arrangement was normal for frontier households where men's labor often required mobility, while women's labor centered on maintaining stable households. Maria did not resent it exactly, but she also recognized that she was raising her children essentially alone despite being married. As Maria moved into her 30s, she became increasingly central to the settlement's informal social structures. She mediated disputes between families, she advised on shared labor arrangements, she maintained the settlement's collective memory, who had helped whom, who owed what, which agreements had been made and needed to be honored. This role carried no official authority and provided no material compensation, but it gave her a kind of social capital that translated into practical benefits. When her family needed help, people were more likely to provide it because they knew Maria would reciprocate when circumstances reversed. The settlement itself changed slowly over these years. Some families left, unable to sustain the life or driven away by accumulated misfortunes. A few new families arrived, bringing fresh labor but also disrupting established social patterns. The total population fluctuated between 40 and 70 individuals depending on the year, never growing large enough to support significant infrastructure, but maintaining enough continuity to preserve institutional memory. The Zemlyanki gradually improved as residents gained experience and resources. Maria and Pyotr expanded their dwelling, adding a better ventilation system and more sophisticated storage chambers. They incorporated techniques learned from indigenous peoples who had lived in the region far longer than Russian settlers, methods of insulation, smoke management, and food preservation that worked better than the approaches settlers had brought from European Russia. These adaptations represented a quiet acknowledgement that survival required learning from local knowledge rather than insisting on imported traditions. In 1828, when Maria was 39, a traveling official arrived to conduct a census of frontier settlements. He spent 3 days recording names, household compositions, and basic economic data. Maria, as one of the settlement's more articulate residents, was interviewed at length. The official asked her about her life, her family's history, her observations about settlement conditions. She answered his questions with the same directness she brought to all interactions, neither exaggerating hardships for sympathy nor minimizing them out of pride. The official recorded her responses in a ledger that would eventually make its way to some archive where it would sit unread for generations. But during the interview, Maria became aware of herself as a historical subject, someone whose experience might be of interest to people in other times and places. The thought was strange and slightly uncomfortable, as though a light had been turned on aspects of her life that she had never considered from an external perspective. The official seemed both impressed by the settlers' resilience and appalled by their conditions. He made various promises about improvements and support that Maria knew would not materialize. She had heard similar promises before and learned not to base plans on them. But his visit did highlight the enormous gap between official understandings of frontier settlement and the actual lived experience of that settlement. In administrative reports, their community was a success. Land was being cultivated, population was sustainable, the frontier was being extended. In reality, they were people surviving through enormous effort in conditions that remained fundamentally marginal and precarious. Both perspectives were accurate in their way, but they described such different realities that they barely seemed to be about the same place. As Maria entered her 40s, her health began showing the cumulative effects of decades of hardship. Her joints ached constantly, particularly in cold weather. Her teeth were largely gone, making certain foods impossible to eat. Her back had developed a permanent curve from years of heavy labor and poor nutrition during growth periods. She tired more easily than she had even a few years earlier. These were normal effects of aging in such circumstances. Most frontier settlers who survived to middle age showed similar deterioration. But Maria also noticed that her role in the community was shifting. Younger women now came to her not just for practical advice, but for something harder to define, a kind of perspective that only came from having lived through decades of repeated hardship without breaking entirely. She found herself telling stories more often, not dramatic tales, but simple accounts of earlier times in the settlement, of people now dead, of changes that had occurred so gradually that younger residents barely noticed them. She was becoming, without intending to, a keeper of collective memory, the person who could provide context and continuity. In 1835, Pyotr did not return from one of his extended hunting expeditions. Weeks passed beyond his expected return date, with no word. Maria waited with a strange mixture of concern and resignation. She had always known that his absences carried risks of accident, illness, or simply getting lost in the vast forest. After 2 months, she accepted that he was probably dead, though without confirmation she could not know for certain. The practical implications were significant. She lost his labor and his income from fur trading, making her household's economic position more precarious. But the emotional impact was complicated in ways she had difficulty articulating. She grieved, but not with the sharp intensity of sudden loss. Pyotr had been absent so much that his permanent absence felt like an extension of temporary absence rather than a fundamental change. She missed him, but she had been missing him intermittently for their entire marriage. She felt the loss most acutely in moments when his specific skills or knowledge would have been useful, less an emotional absence than a practical one. Maria continued managing her household with her daughter's help. Ekaterina was now 20 and Anna 16, both old enough to perform adult labor. Together they maintained their zemlyanka, cultivated their plot, managed their remaining animals. They operated as a female household in a settlement where most labor patterns were organized around male-female partnerships, which created certain challenges but also certain freedoms. They could make decisions without negotiating with male authority. They could organize their time according to their own priorities. They could keep the full product of their labor rather than sharing it. These were modest advantages, but in their circumstances, any advantage mattered. The settlement continued its slow, almost imperceptible changes. A few families achieved modest prosperity through successful fur trading or unusually good harvests. Others slipped into poverty so extreme they became dependent on community charity. The gap between the most and least successful households widened, creating new social tensions. Maria watched these dynamics with the detached interest of someone who had learned that circumstances could change rapidly in either direction, and that treating temporary advantages as permanent was foolish. She maintained good relationships across the settlement's economic spectrum, refusing to align herself too closely with any particular faction. This neutrality required constant, subtle work, helping some families, declining to help others, navigating disputes without taking sides that would create permanent enemies. It was exhausting in its way, but it was also necessary for maintaining her household's position. In her 50s, Maria began having periods where she felt she was experiencing her life from a slight distance, as though watching herself perform actions rather than fully inhabiting them. This was not unpleasant exactly, but it was disorienting. She wondered sometimes whether this was simply what aging felt like, or whether decades of repetitive hardship had created some kind of protective dissociation. She did not dwell on these questions. Introspection was another luxury her life did not accommodate. But she noticed the shift. Her daughters began their own households. Ekaterina married a young man from a neighboring settlement, while Anna entered a partnership with a widower who needed help managing his children from his first marriage. Maria helped them establish their homes, sharing resources and knowledge, creating a network of linked households that provided mutual support. She lived now with her elderly mother, who had somehow survived into her 80s despite conditions that killed most people far younger. They shared their zemlyanka, two women who had lived through the same events but experienced them differently, their relationship characterized by long, familiar silences and occasional sharp conflicts that dissipated as quickly as they arose. Maria's life settled into a pattern that felt, if not comfortable, at least stable. She woke each morning in darkness. She performed the tasks that needed performing. She watched seasons change in their predictable cycle. She went to sleep each night not knowing if she would wake the next morning, but assuming she probably would. She had become the person younger settlers came to for guidance, the person officials consulted when they needed information about settlement history or conditions. She had become, without intending to, a minor figure of authority in a place that barely registered in any official consciousness. When Maria was 63 in the spring of 1852, she noticed that waking had become harder, not more painful exactly, but requiring more deliberate effort. She felt that she was moving through water, that everything took more time and more energy than it should. She recognized these sensations as warning signs that her body was beginning its final decline. She did not panic or grieve. She had lived long enough to have reached old age in frontier conditions, which was itself a kind of achievement. She spent that summer putting her affairs in order, not through formal legal arrangements, which were largely unavailable in such remote settlements, but through conversations with her daughters and clear verbal instructions about how she wanted things handled after her death. She worked through the summer as she always had, but with a new sense of finality, of completing rather than continuing. As autumn arrived and the cold began returning, Maria found herself reflecting on the strange shape her life had taken. She had been born in one world and had lived her entire adult life in another. She had survived conditions that should have killed her multiple times over. She had raised children in circumstances that were fundamentally hostile to childhood. She had maintained dignity and humanity in a context that constantly threatened to strip both away. She had become a kind of anonymous monument to endurance, her specific experiences representing patterns that thousands of other settlers had also lived through, most of them equally unnamed and unremembered. Maria died in early winter of that year, in the Zemlyanka she had lived in for most of her adult life. Her death was quiet. She went to sleep and did not wake, her body simply deciding that it had done enough. Her daughters buried her in the small settlement cemetery, a plot of ground on a hillside where the soil was easier to dig. There was no marker beyond a simple wooden cross that would rot and disappear within a few years. But the people who knew her remembered not just her life, but what her life represented. The possibility of maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances, of continuing when continuation seemed impossible, of finding small dignities in daily routine, even when those routines were defined by hardship and repetition and endless cold pressing down from above. Maria Sidorovna's life was not exceptional by frontier standards. Thousands of women lived similar lives in similar conditions during the long expansion of Russian settlement into Siberia. But her ordinariness is precisely what makes her story valuable. She shows us what it actually meant to be a frontier settler, not in terms of dramatic moments or heroic achievements, but in terms of daily survival across the span of a lifetime. She shows us that most history is made by ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary pressure, people whose names are never recorded, but whose collective endurance shapes the world in ways that are easy to overlook, but impossible to dismiss. Let us drift now from the particular to the puzzle, from individual lives to the strange archaeological questions that emerge when we examine the physical traces these settlers left behind. The Zemlyanki themselves, those half-buried structures that defined frontier existence, hold mysteries that archaeologists and historians are still working to understand fully. When excavations began in the mid-20th century at sites of abandoned Siberian settlements, researchers expected to find relatively uniform structures, simple dugouts that followed predictable patterns based on practical necessity. What they found instead was far more complex and more puzzling. Some Zemlyanki had entry tunnels that descended at steep angles before opening into the main living chamber, creating a design that seemed unnecessarily complicated. The extra labor required to dig these elaborate entrances suggested they served some purpose beyond simple access, but what that purpose was remained unclear. The descending tunnels varied considerably in their execution, some plunging down at angles approaching 45 degrees before leveling out, others creating a stepped descent that would have required careful excavation of earthen stairs that must have been continually maintained against erosion and collapse. The variety itself posed questions about whether these designs emerged from different cultural traditions, practical adaptations to varying soil conditions, or simply individual preferences among builders who had no standardized plans to follow. Other structures had multiple chambers connected by narrow passages, creating underground complexes that resembled warrens more than houses. These were not expansions added over time, but deliberate original designs, their complexity suggesting planning and intention that went beyond improvisation. The multi-chambered designs showed evidence of careful engineering, with support posts positioned to bear weight loads and passages angled to facilitate drainage of moisture that inevitably accumulated in underground spaces. The effort required to create these subterranean networks was substantial, suggesting that the residents anticipated remaining in place long enough to justify the investment of labor, an expectation that was sometimes fulfilled and sometimes disappointed as settlements grew or were abandoned. The most perplexing feature of many Zemlyanki was their smoke ventilation systems. Simple logic would suggest that smoke holes should be positioned at the highest point of the roof to allow heat and smoke to escape efficiently. But archaeologists found ventilation shafts positioned at odd angles, sometimes running horizontally for several feet before turning upward, sometimes branching into multiple smaller channels, sometimes aligned with what appeared to be celestial directions, due south or positioned to face the winter sunrise. These designs required significantly more labor to construct than straightforward vertical shafts would have demanded. The horizontal sections of ventilation channels were particularly puzzling because they seemed to contradict basic principles of convection, yet when tested in experimental reconstructions, they often created surprisingly effective draft systems that drew smoke out efficiently while preventing downdrafts that could fill living spaces with suffocating fumes. The channels sometimes incorporated clay or stone baffles that appeared to regulate airflow in ways that suggested sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics, though this knowledge was clearly empirical rather than theoretical, learned through observation and experimentation rather than through any formal education in physics. Some researchers initially theorized these complicated ventilation systems were simply mistakes, the result of inexperienced builders trying different approaches until something worked. But the patterns appeared too consistently across too many sites to be random experimentation. Moreover, when archaeologists tested reconstructions of these unusual smoke channels, they often found they worked remarkably well, sometimes better than simpler designs would have in the same conditions. The settlers had clearly understood something about airflow and heat management that was not immediately obvious to modern observers. The realization that frontier builders possessed specialized knowledge that contemporary researchers had to rediscover through scientific testing humbled some of the early assumptions about these settlements as primitive or improvised. The structures revealed themselves to be sophisticated responses to environmental challenges, embodying accumulated wisdom that had been refined through trial and error across generations and transmitted through demonstration and practice rather than through written manuals or formal instruction. One site in particular captured researchers' attention, a cluster of 7 Zemlyanki discovered in the 1970s near the Lena River. All 7 structures shared similar unusual features, entrance tunnels that curved rather than proceeding in straight lines, interior walls that had been carefully smoothed, and in some cases covered with birch bark arranged in geometric patterns, and smoke vents that seemed to align with the position of sunrise during winter solstice. The curved entrance tunnels served no obvious practical purpose. Straight tunnels would have been easier to dig and maintain, yet all 7 structures incorporated this feature, suggesting it held significance beyond mere utility. The birch bark coverings on interior walls showed patterns that repeated across structures with enough consistency to suggest they were intentional designs rather than random decoration, though what those patterns meant or represented remained frustratingly unclear. The site also contained carved wooden posts at specific locations around and between the structures, though what these posts marked or represented remained uncertain. Were they property boundaries, ritual markers, astronomical observation points, or something else entirely? The posts had been placed with apparent precision, their positions forming geometric relationships that seemed deliberate but whose purpose defied easy interpretation. Some researchers noted that lines drawn between the posts created patterns that might correspond to important celestial alignments, while others suggested the arrangement could mark underground water sources, property divisions, or simply convenient locations for tethering animals or hanging tools. The artifacts recovered from these sites added to the mystery rather than resolving it. Mixed in with predictable items, iron tools, ceramic vessels, fragments of cloth, were objects whose purposes were less clear. Small clay figurines appeared repeatedly, most of them depicting animals but in abstract stylized forms that made specific identification difficult. Were these toys, religious objects, decorative items, or something else? The figurines ranged from crude lumps with barely recognizable features to carefully crafted forms that showed considerable artistic skill, suggesting they were made by different hands or served different purposes within the community. Some had been deliberately broken or damaged, their fragments scattered across living areas in ways that might indicate ritual destruction, accidental breakage, or simply disposal of objects that had outlived their usefulness. Pieces of wood with complex patterns of notches carved into them turned up at multiple sites. Some researchers interpreted these as tally sticks for keeping track of supplies or recording time. Others suggested they might be calendars marking important dates or seasons. Still others proposed they could be mnemonic devices for remembering oral traditions or songs. The notches followed patterns that seemed systematic rather than random, repeated sequences, regular spacing, occasional special marks that stood out from the standard cuts, but without a key to decode them, they remained ambiguous texts whose content could only be guessed at. The very existence of such marked objects demonstrated that settlers felt the need to record or track something systematically, that they were not simply living from day to day without longer-term planning or memory keeping. The objects themselves provided no definitive answers. They were simply marked wood, their meaning dependent entirely on how they had been used, and that use had died with the people who made them. This ambiguity is characteristic of archaeological evidence generally, but it feels particularly acute when studying populations that left almost no written records. Perhaps most intriguing were the birch bark containers found in storage chambers. Birch bark was common material for making vessels, valued for its flexibility and water resistance. But some of these containers had been decorated with imagery that seemed to combine Russian Orthodox symbols with designs that appeared to come from indigenous Siberian traditions, crosses alongside spiral patterns, saints' names alongside what might be stylized animal forms. The blending suggested cultural exchange and adaptation occurring in ways that official records never captured. The decorative elements showed skilled craftsmanship, with fine incised lines creating detailed patterns that must have required considerable time and effort to execute. The fact that such care was lavished on humble storage containers suggested that aesthetic expression was important enough to merit investment of labor, even in purely functional objects, that the impulse to create beauty persisted even in conditions where survival demanded most of people's energy and attention. Archaeological evidence of indigenous influence on settler architecture became impossible to ignore as more sites were studied. The basic concept of the zemlyanka, a partially underground dwelling, was not originally Russian. Indigenous peoples across Siberia had been building similar structures for thousands of years, adapting them to specific local conditions and cultural preferences. When Russian settlers arrived, they initially tried to build the above-ground log houses they had known in European Russia. These structures failed repeatedly in Siberian conditions, requiring too much wood, losing too much heat, vulnerable to extreme winds, difficult to maintain through long winters. Settlers who survived were those who learned from indigenous neighbors, adopting and adapting underground building techniques that had been refined over generations. The failure rate of traditional Russian structures in Siberian conditions was catastrophic enough that documentary evidence occasionally mentions it, with reports of settlers freezing to death in houses that could not maintain livable temperatures or structures collapsing under snow loads they were never designed to bear. The adoption of underground building techniques represented not just practical adaptation, but survival necessity, a fundamental reorientation from imported knowledge to local expertise. The influence went beyond basic structure to include specific construction techniques. The use of turf as insulation, the strategic placement of storage pits to take advantage of naturally cold underground temperatures, the methods for preventing moisture seepage through earthen walls, all of these appeared to incorporate indigenous knowledge. Some zemlyanki showed evidence of construction techniques that were clearly indigenous in origin, such as the use of willow withes woven through vertical posts to create flexible walls that could withstand ground movement during freeze-thaw cycles. This technique had no precedent in Russian building traditions, but was common among indigenous Siberian peoples. The willow weaving technique demonstrated sophisticated understanding of materials and forces. The flexible withes could bend and shift without breaking as the ground expanded and contracted with temperature changes, while rigid walls would crack and fail under the same stresses. The transmission of this knowledge from indigenous builders to Russian settlers must have involved direct instruction and demonstration, moments of cross-cultural teaching that left no written record but whose results are visible in the archaeological remains. The cultural exchange seems to have operated in both directions, though the evidence for this is more fragmentary. Some archaeological sites that were clearly indigenous showed incorporation of Russian tools and construction elements, iron nails instead of wooden pegs, ceramic stoves alongside traditional hearths, glass beads and metal buttons mixed with traditional ornaments. These exchanges were happening at an informal, individual level, person to person, family to family, driven by practical necessity and geographic proximity rather than by any official policy or organized cultural program. They represent a kind of history that leaves traces in material culture but rarely appears in written documents. The bidirectional nature of exchange challenges simple narratives of cultural dominance or resistance, revealing instead a more complex reality where people borrowed, adapted, and integrated elements that seemed useful while maintaining aspects of their own traditions they valued. The archaeological evidence suggests pragmatism rather than rigid adherence to cultural purity on any side. People used what worked, regardless of its origins. Researchers have tried to understand indigenous perspectives on these interactions through oral histories collected much later, though these accounts come with their own interpretive challenges. Some indigenous accounts describe Russian settlers as difficult neighbors, taking land, disrupting hunting territories, bringing diseases. But other accounts acknowledge periods of cooperation and mutual aid, times when indigenous knowledge helped settlers survive, and settler goods provided items indigenous peoples found useful. The reality was likely complex and variable, changing across time and location, never fitting neatly into simple narratives of conflict or cooperation. The oral histories, collected decades or even centuries after the initial contact periods, are filtered through subsequent experiences and historical developments that colored how earlier interactions were remembered and recounted. Yet they provide perspectives absent from Russian written records, reminding us that every historical encounter involved multiple viewpoints and that the traces settlers left behind existed within larger networks of indigenous presence and knowledge that preceded them and continued around them. The question of why certain Zemlyanka designs proliferated while others disappeared remains partially mysterious. Some architectural features spread through the settler population rapidly, suggesting they worked well enough that people copied them. Other features appeared at a few sites then vanished from the archaeological record, possibly because they proved impractical or because the knowledge of how to construct them was not successfully transmitted. The pattern of architectural diffusion reveals a kind of experimental process happening across generations, trying approaches, keeping what worked, abandoning what didn't. The spread of successful designs must have occurred through observation and conversation, with travelers and traders carrying news of innovations that proved effective in particular conditions. A successful ventilation system design could spread across hundreds of kilometers as people shared information about what worked in their own structures, while failed experiments were quietly abandoned and forgotten, leaving only occasional archaeological traces of approaches that were tried and discarded. But some design elements persisted even though their practical benefits were not obvious. The alignment of certain structures with astronomical features falls into this category. Researchers have documented multiple sites where smoke holes or entrance tunnels align with significant solar events, solstices or equinoxes. Maintaining these alignments required extra effort during construction and provided no clear practical advantage. The astronomical alignments were precise enough that they could not be attributed to chance. The probability of random construction producing such consistent orientations was vanishingly small. Yet the effort to achieve these alignments was considerable, requiring careful observation of the sun's path, planning construction to begin at specific times of year, and executing the work with enough precision that the final structure captured sunlight or aligned with sunrise at the intended moment. The alignments might have been purely practical, using celestial events as calendars to help track the passing of seasons. Or they might have held cultural or ritual significance that we can no longer access because the meanings died with the people who created them, or possibly both. Practical orientation could have acquired ritual significance over time, or ritual practices could have been justified through practical benefits. The archaeological evidence alone cannot distinguish between these possibilities. The ambiguity reflects a fundamental challenge in interpreting material remains without access to the beliefs and explanations that animated their creation. We see the choices people made, where to position an opening, how to orient a structure, but the reasoning behind those choices remains opaque unless it was recorded in writing or preserved in oral tradition, neither of which survived for these particular communities. Excavations have also revealed the existence of structures that seem to have served specialized purposes beyond residential dwelling. Some underground chambers were clearly storage facilities, no hearth, no living areas, just carefully constructed spaces for preserving food and goods. Others appear to have been workshops where specific crafts were practiced. Evidence of metalworking, leather processing, and textile production has been found in chambers separate from main living quarters. The separation of workspaces from living spaces demonstrated planning and organization that went beyond minimal survival, suggesting communities that had moved past the initial desperate scramble for subsistence toward more stable patterns of life that could accommodate specialized labor and division of tasks. The workshop chambers showed evidence of repeated use over extended periods, with accumulated debris from manufacturing processes building up in layers that recorded years or decades of productive activity. But there are also structures whose purposes remain genuinely unclear. Small chambers, carefully constructed but showing little evidence of regular occupation or specific use. Were these emergency shelters, guest accommodations, ritual spaces, storage for items that left no archaeological trace? The chambers were finished with the same care as living spaces, smoothed walls, proper drainage, carefully constructed roofs, suggesting they were valued and maintained rather than being abandoned failures or half-finished projects. Their very completeness makes their emptiness puzzling. People invested significant labor in creating functional underground spaces that then remained largely unused, at least in ways that left material evidence. The most mysterious category consists of chambers that were deliberately filled in after construction, not collapsed by accident or abandoned to decay naturally, but intentionally buried with earth and rocks. Why would people invest enormous labor in building underground structures only to fill them in? One theory suggests these might have been burial chambers, though human remains are rarely found in them. Another possibility is that they served some temporary ritual purpose, then were closed according to cultural practices we don't understand. Or perhaps they were simply mistakes, failed experiments that didn't work as intended and were abandoned. Without written records or oral histories specific to these sites, we are left with structures that pose questions they cannot answer. The deliberate filling shows organization and effort. The earth and rocks used to fill the chambers had to be transported and packed carefully to completely fill the spaces, suggesting that closure was purposeful rather than casual. Whatever motivated the filling, it was important enough to warrant considerable labor, which deepens rather than resolves the mystery of why these chambers were created in the first place. The recovery of organic materials from some sites has provided glimpses of daily life that complement the architectural evidence. Preserved in cold, dry conditions, fragments of clothing, rope, and basketry reveal craftsmanship that combined Russian and indigenous techniques. Boots made from reindeer hide using indigenous methods but cut in Russian styles. Rope twisted from materials and in patterns that drew on both traditions. Baskets woven using indigenous techniques but shaped to accommodate Russian tools and goods. These hybrid objects speak to the practical creativity that characterized frontier life, people using whatever worked, borrowing techniques across cultural boundaries, creating new forms that suited their specific circumstances. The clothing fragments show repair and modification, patches added, and items altered to extend their useful life in conditions where replacement was difficult or impossible. Some garments had been repaired multiple times with whatever materials were available, creating patchworks that combined Russian cloth with animal hides, imported thread with plant fibers, demonstrating resourcefulness born of necessity. Food remains tell stories about survival strategies and cultural adaptation. The expected grains and domesticated animal bones appear alongside evidence of extensive foraging and hunting, remains of fish, wild birds, small mammals, and plant materials that settlers learned to exploit. Some food preparation techniques clearly came from indigenous traditions, particular methods of drying fish, ways of processing certain plants to make them edible, strategies for extracting maximum nutrition from animal carcasses. Survival in these conditions required learning and adapting, not rigid adherence to imported traditions. The diversity of food remains suggests diets that were opportunistic and varied, making use of whatever was available in different seasons, rather than relying on stable supplies of preferred foods. The remains of plant materials show knowledge of which local plants were edible or useful, knowledge that could only have been acquired from indigenous peoples who had been exploiting these resources for generations. The settlement patterns themselves present puzzles. Why did some locations attract multiple families while others supported only isolated households? Proximity to water and timber was obviously important, but sites with apparently similar access to resources showed very different levels of occupation. Social factors must have played a role: kinship networks, conflict dynamics, reputation of particular areas, but these factors leave little archaeological trace. Some settlements were clearly organized, with structures arranged in patterns that suggest planning and coordination. Others appear almost random, scattered across landscapes with no obvious organizing principle. The organized settlements often showed evidence of communal facilities, shared workspaces, common storage areas, larger gathering structures that implied cooperation and collective decision-making. The scattered settlements lacked such facilities, suggesting either different social organization or simply isolation that prevented the kind of coordination required for communal infrastructure. The organized settlements tended to be longer-lasting, appearing in the archaeological record across longer time periods, while the scattered settlements often showed brief occupation before abandonment. But whether organization led to stability or stability allowed, organization cannot be determined from physical evidence alone. The correlation between organization and longevity suggests that successful settlements required some degree of social cohesion and cooperative planning, that isolated families struggling independently were less likely to persist than groups that pooled labor and resources. Yet the direction of causation remains unclear. Did people organize because they intended to stay, or did organization enable staying? The question of communication between settlements adds another layer of mystery. These communities were separated by enormous distances, days or weeks of travel through difficult terrain. Yet archaeological evidence shows that goods, technologies, and probably information moved between them. Certain tool types appear at multiple sites, suggesting either common sources or transmission of manufacturing knowledge. Design elements in architecture spread across regions too large for coincidence. Stories and songs likely traveled along the same paths as goods and techniques, though these leave no physical trace. The similarity of artifacts across vast distances demonstrates that these settlements were not completely isolated, that they existed within networks of contact and exchange that connected frontier communities despite the forbidding landscapes that separated them. The networks were informal and irregular compared to trade routes in more developed regions, but they functioned well enough to transmit not just objects, but also ideas, techniques, and cultural practices. How did this communication network function without formal infrastructure? Traveling traders certainly played a role, carrying goods and news between settlements. Hunters moving through forests might stop at multiple locations, sharing information as they went. Government officials, though rare, would have connected distant communities through their rounds. Religious figures traveling circuits to serve scattered populations would have been conduits for both spiritual guidance and secular information. But the details of how news traveled, how innovations spread, how collective decisions were made across distances remain largely mysterious. The informal nature of these networks makes them difficult to trace archaeologically. Travelers left little evidence beyond occasional lost objects or brief mentions in documents that focused on official business, rather than the gossip, news, and technical information that likely constituted most of what was shared. Yet the effects of the networks are visible in the spread of innovations and the movement of goods, testifying to connections that functioned beneath the level of official record-keeping. The seasonal rhythms of these settlements are partially visible in archaeological evidence. Certain activities clearly happened at specific times of year, leaving concentrated remains, fish bones suggesting spring or summer processing, evidence of concentrated textile production during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. But the emotional and social rhythms of seasonal life, the anticipation of spring, the desperation of late winter, the brief intensity of summer labor, these can only be inferred, not directly observed. The archaeology gives us the skeleton of seasonal patterns, but not the lived experience of moving through them. The concentration of certain types of debris in specific layers of excavation reveals the annual cycle of activities, but the experience of that cycle, the psychological weight of darkness and cold, the relief when days finally lengthened, the frantic urgency of summer preparations, cannot be recovered from material remains. We know what people did, but can only imagine how it felt to do it. Researchers have found evidence of winter storytelling traditions in the form of carved items that seem to be narrative aids, wooden pieces with sequential imagery that might illustrate traditional tales. But without the stories themselves, these objects remain tantalizingly incomplete. We can see that storytelling happened, that it was important enough to create physical objects to support it, but we cannot recover the actual narratives. This is perhaps archaeology's most fundamental limitation. It can show us that meaning existed but cannot always reveal what that meaning was. The narrative aids are crafted with care, suggesting that the stories they accompanied were valued and that their telling was a significant cultural practice. Some pieces show wear patterns indicating they were handled repeatedly, passed from hand to hand, used again and again through long winters when outdoor activity was impossible and communities gathered inside to pass time and maintain cultural memory through oral tradition. The question of ritual and belief in these settlements is similarly challenging. The presence of orthodox religious items, crosses, icons, fragments of religious texts, demonstrates that Christian practice continued on the frontier, but the items often show signs of adaptation and syncretic mixing with other traditions. Crosses decorated with non-Christian symbols, icons positioned in ways that suggest they served multiple purposes, religious texts used in fragments for non-religious purposes like patching or insulation. Were these signs of religious decline in isolated conditions, practical adaptations that maintained core beliefs while adjusting practices, or genuine religious innovation creating new forms of spirituality? The archaeological evidence supports multiple interpretations. The mixing of religious and practical functions challenges neat categories of sacred and secular, suggesting that frontier residents may not have maintained the same strict boundaries between religious and ordinary life that characterized more formal religious practice in established communities. The use of religious texts for insulation seems shocking to modern sensibilities, but may have reflected pragmatic attitudes toward material objects combined with internalized faith that did not depend on possession of physical texts. Some zemlyanki contained small alcoves or niches that might have been icon corners, spaces for religious imagery in domestic settings. But similar niches in other structures held entirely secular items, tools, supplies, personal belongings. The same architectural feature could serve religious purposes in one household and practical purposes in another, or might serve both purposes in ways that the residents saw no need to distinguish. This ambiguity reminds us that the categories we use to interpret evidence, religious versus secular, traditional versus innovative, might not reflect how the people themselves understood their own practices. Evidence of death and burial practices adds another dimension to the mystery. Cemeteries associated with settlements show varied burial practices. Some graves aligned east-west, following orthodox tradition, others oriented differently. Some burials included grave goods, others did not. Some showed evidence of wooden coffins, others of simple shrouding. The variation suggests either that orthodox practices were inconsistently followed, or that different families maintained different traditions, or that beliefs about death and afterlife were evolving in frontier conditions. Without written theology or recorded beliefs, we see the practices but cannot fully access the meanings behind them. The burial practices reveal communities navigating between tradition and adaptation, maintaining some elements of familiar ritual while modifying others in response to circumstances or evolving beliefs. The variation within single cemeteries demonstrates that even small communities contained diversity of practice, that there was no single authoritative way of dealing with death that all residents followed. Child burials are particularly numerous in these cemeteries, a stark reminder of mortality rates in these conditions. But the way children were buried sometimes differed from adult burial practices. Smaller graves, different orientations, different or absent grave goods. Did this reflect different beliefs about children's spiritual status, practical considerations about available resources, or emotional responses to losses that were tragically common? The archaeology shows that children were treated differently in death, but cannot definitively explain why. The high proportion of child burials testifies to the brutal reality of frontier life, where diseases, accidents, malnutrition, and exposure killed the young at rates that modern observers find difficult to fully comprehend. The demographic impact of such mortality would have been profound, affecting everything from family structure to community viability to the transmission of knowledge across generations. Some burial sites show evidence of later visitation, paths worn to certain graves, small offerings left long after initial burial, careful maintenance of grave markers. These suggest ongoing relationships with the dead that continued across years or generations, but other graves show no signs of return visits, possibly reflecting families that moved away or died out, or perhaps different cultural attitudes about maintaining connection with the deceased. The pattern is variable enough to resist simple explanation. The maintained graves demonstrate that some families or communities sustained practices of remembrance despite the practical difficulties of frontier life, that honoring the dead remained important enough to warrant continued effort. The unmarked or unvisited graves pose more troubling questions about isolation, loss of community memory, or families whose entire line ended without survivors to maintain the connection. The mystery deepens when we consider structures that were clearly important, but whose importance we cannot fully grasp. At several sites, archaeologists found what appeared to be gathering spaces, larger underground chambers with evidence of repeated use by multiple people but no signs of residential occupation. Were these community meeting places, sites for collective labor like food processing, locations for social or religious gatherings, or something else? The spaces were deliberately created and maintained, suggesting significance, but their specific functions remain uncertain. The gathering spaces were often more carefully constructed than ordinary living quarters, with more elaborate support systems and finishing work, indicating that they held special status or served purposes that warranted extra investment of labor. The evidence of repeated use, compacted floors, accumulated soot on walls, wear patterns around entrances, demonstrates they were functional spaces actively used by the community rather than symbolic structures that existed primarily as ideas. One such site contained a large hearth surrounded by stones arranged in a careful pattern, with evidence of intense heat use over extended periods. The structure was not suitable for metalworking, wrong shape, wrong ventilation, and seemed too elaborate for simple cooking. Some researchers speculated it might have been a bathhouse, adapting Russian banya traditions to underground construction. Others suggested it could be a communal cooking facility for large gatherings. Still others wondered if it served ritual purposes, purification, seasonal ceremonies, rites of passage. The structure itself is clear, its meaning is not. The careful stone arrangement and evidence of sustained high temperatures suggest specialized use that went beyond casual or occasional activity, implying regular communal practices that were central enough to settlement life to warrant maintaining the structure across time. The absence of definitive evidence for any single function may itself be informative. Perhaps the space served multiple purposes at different times, adapting to whatever communal needs arose. Archaeologists working on these sites often describe a sense of reaching toward meanings that remain just out of grasp. The evidence is rich and detailed, showing us how people built, what they ate, how they organized space, where they placed things. But the why behind these choices, the cultural logic, the personal meanings, the collective understandings that made these arrangements seem natural and necessary to the people who created them, this remains partially opaque. We see the material residue of lives lived but cannot fully recover the consciousness that animated those lives. This sense of reaching toward but not quite grasping meaning pervades archaeological work generally, but it feels particularly acute in studying communities that existed at the margins of literate culture. With no written accounts from the residents themselves, no letters or diaries or memoirs, we must reconstruct their lives entirely from objects and structures that were never created to communicate with future researchers. This is not entirely frustrating, though it might seem so. There is something oddly appropriate about the fact that these frontier settlements retain their mysteries even after careful study. The people who lived in them existed at the margins of recorded history, their experiences largely unwritten, their voices not preserved in archives or official accounts. The archaeological mysteries mirror the historical silences, both pointing toward lives lived outside the structures that typically preserve and transmit cultural memory. The persistence of mystery honors, in a sense, the obscurity in which these people lived. They were not trying to leave messages for posterity, not consciously creating historical records, simply living their lives as best they could in difficult circumstances. That their traces remain partially illegible reminds us that most human experience across history has been similarly unrecorded and irrecoverable. What we can say with confidence is that the material evidence reveals far more complexity than simple narratives of frontier hardship would suggest. These were not people simply surviving in desperate conditions, though survival was certainly difficult. They were people adapting, innovating, exchanging knowledge, making choices about how to organize their lives and spaces, maintaining cultural practices while also transforming them, creating new forms that combined elements from multiple traditions. The archaeology shows us this creativity and adaptation even when it cannot explain every specific choice. The complexity visible in the archaeological record challenges assumptions about frontier life as crude or primitive, revealing instead communities that maintained cultural practices, aesthetic sensibilities, and social organization despite isolation and hardship. The care taken in constructing even humble structures, the attention to decoration on functional objects, the maintenance of burial practices and communal spaces, all of this demonstrates that these were people trying to live fully human lives, not merely to subsist. The underground structures themselves, those zemlyanki that define the frontier experience, turn out to be less simple than they initially appear. They were not just holes in the ground with roofs, not just practical solutions to practical problems. They were carefully designed spaces that reflected accumulated knowledge, cultural values, practical constraints, and possibly spiritual or cosmological understandings. They were architecture in the fullest sense, shaped space that both responded to and helped create particular ways of living. The sophistication of Zemlyanka design becomes more apparent the more carefully the structures are studied, with features that initially seemed crude or improvised, revealing themselves to be carefully considered solutions to complex problems of heating, ventilation, moisture control, and structural stability. The structures represent vernacular architecture at its most refined, building traditions that emerged from accumulated experience rather than formal training, but that achieved remarkable effectiveness through generations of refinement. That many of their design features remain mysterious does not diminish their significance. If anything, the mysteries remind us that historical understanding is always partial, always incomplete, always reaching toward experiences that cannot be fully recovered. The people who built these structures and lived in them possessed knowledge we have lost, not just technical knowledge about construction, though that too, but experiential knowledge about what it meant to live underground through Siberian winters, to balance Russian and indigenous traditions, to create meaning and dignity in circumstances that seem designed to strip both away. That knowledge cannot be fully retrieved through archaeology alone, but its traces remain in the structures they left behind, posing questions that invite continued exploration and interpretation. The loss of this experiential knowledge represents a kind of historical forgetting that affects not just these particular settlements but countless communities throughout history whose ways of living never entered written record. We can see that they knew things, the evidence demonstrates competence and understanding, but we cannot fully recover what they knew or how they learned it or what it felt like to possess that knowledge. The study of these underground settlements continues, with new sites discovered periodically and new analytical techniques applied to existing evidence. Each excavation adds pieces to the puzzle, but the puzzle itself never quite resolves into a complete picture. Perhaps this is as it should be. These settlements existed at the edge of the known world, places where official knowledge faded and local knowledge became paramount. It seems fitting that they retain some of their remoteness, some of their strangeness, even as we study them. They remain, in important ways, at the margins, not fully integrated into historical narratives, not completely explained by archaeological analysis, not entirely domesticated by academic understanding. Their marginality reflects not just their geographic location, but their position in relation to systems of knowledge and power, too distant from centers of authority to be closely monitored, too small to merit much official attention, inhabited by people whose lives were not considered historically significant by those who controlled the creation and preservation of written records. That we study them now represents a shift in what we consider historically important, but it cannot fully overcome the historical silences that resulted from their marginal status. They persist as places of mystery, sites where the past is present but not entirely legible, where evidence accumulates but meaning remains elusive, where we can see that significance existed without being able to fully specify what that significance was. This ambiguity is itself informative, reminding us of the limits of historical knowledge and the irreducible complexity of human experience across time. The ambiguity invites humility about what we can know of the past, and about how much of human experience remains forever beyond our reach. The archaeological evidence is generous in what it reveals, so much about daily life, technology, adaptation, and creativity becomes visible through careful excavation and analysis. Yet generous as it cannot answer all our questions or satisfy all our curiosity about these vanished communities. These frontier settlements, with their underground structures and hybrid cultural practices, their careful astronomical alignments and mysterious marked sticks, their blended decorative traditions and communal gathering spaces, continue to pose questions that research may never fully answer. They stand as monuments to lives lived at the margins, to knowledge that was possessed and then lost, to human resilience and creativity in the face of daunting circumstances, and to the ultimate inscrutability of past experience. We can study them, learn from them, honor them with our attention and our puzzlement, but we cannot fully possess their meanings or completely understand the consciousness of those who built them and lived in them and eventually abandoned them to time and earth and scholarly speculation. Let us now rise from the earth and the mysteries it holds and turn our attention to a different world that existed in the same landscape during the same winters under the same vast Siberian sky. While settlers lived half-buried in frozen ground, another population moved through warmed rooms and gaslit corridors, their lives shaped by the same climate, but insulated from its worst effects by wealth, position, and architectural permanence. The contrast was not absolute. No one in Siberia, regardless of status, could entirely escape the winter's grip. But the difference between living underground in a zemlyanka and living in a proper masonry house with ceramic stoves was so profound that the two groups might as well have inhabited different worlds entirely, their lives overlapping geographically but separated by an enormous gulf of daily experience. In towns like Irkutsk, Tobolsk, and Yakutsk, a small class of merchants, administrators, military officers, and Orthodox clergy maintained a lifestyle that borrowed its forms from European Russia while adapting them to Siberian realities. These were not enormous cities. Even the largest might hold only a few thousand permanent residents, but they were centers of administration, trade, and culture in a region where such centers were rare. The houses of wealthy merchants stood as visible markers of this different world. Built from timber or brick, 2 or even 3 stories tall, with proper foundations and shingled roofs, these structures declared their owner's status through sheer solidity. Glass windows, rare and expensive in the Siberian context, allowed light to enter rooms that were heated by large ceramic stoves, massive constructions that could warm an entire floor when properly stoked. The windows were often double-paned with a layer of air between for insulation, a technology that frontier settlers could not imagine affording. Inside these houses, daily life proceeded according to rhythms that bore some resemblance to life in St. Petersburg or Moscow, though always with Siberian modifications. Morning began not in darkness but in lamplight, with servants already having risen to stoke fires and prepare hot water. The master or mistress of the house would wake in a bedroom that, while cold by modern standards, was incomparably warmer than the interior of a zemlyanka. Frost did not form on interior walls here. Breath did not create visible clouds in sleeping quarters. Breakfast was a substantial affair, not the thin porridge and hard bread of frontier life, but proper food brought from storerooms or purchased fresh at market. Tea was central to elite Siberian life, imported from China along trade routes that made Siberia wealthy even as most of its inhabitants remained poor. The tea was served in samovars, elaborate metal vessels that kept water constantly hot, becoming both functional objects and status symbols. A wealthy household might own several samovars of different sizes and designs, each appropriate to different social occasions. The tea itself was drunk from porcelain cups or glasses, sweetened with sugar that traveled thousands of miles to reach Siberian tables. This simple daily ritual, drinking hot tea in a warm room, represented a level of comfort that was simply unavailable to the underground settlers living just miles away. Food supplies for elite households came through different channels than those available to common settlers. While frontier families ate what they could grow, hunt, or forage. Wealthy urban residents had access to markets where goods from across Siberia and beyond could be purchased. Salted fish came from the northern coasts and rivers. Flour was imported from southern agricultural regions, producing bread that was actually soft and white rather than dark and dense. Preserved fruits, jam, dried berries, even occasionally candied citrus that had traveled from unimaginably distant places provided variety that frontier diets never included. Meat was more plentiful and more varied. Beef, pork, sometimes game animals prepared by skilled cooks rather than hastily roasted over open fires. The wealthy did not personally perform most domestic labor. Servants, often recruited from the same populations that supplied frontier settlers, people whose circumstances left them with few options, maintained fires, prepared food, cleaned rooms, hauled water, and performed the countless tasks necessary to maintain a comfortable household. This created an interesting dynamic where the elite class could remain largely ignorant of the practical challenges their lifestyle depended on overcoming. A merchant's wife might complain about the cold while being entirely unaware of what cold actually meant to someone living underground without adequate heating. She knew winter was difficult because her servants mentioned it, because sometimes goods became temporarily unavailable, because social events occasionally had to be cancelled due to extreme weather. But she experienced these as inconveniences rather than existential threats. The clothing of the elite marked them as distinctly as their housing. Fur was ubiquitous across all classes in Siberia. The climate demanded it, but the quality and variety of furs created clear status distinctions. A frontier settler might own a single fur coat made from locally available pelts, worn until it fell apart and then patched together for more years. A wealthy merchant might own multiple fur garments made from sable, fox, or imported furs. Each coat, representing more wealth than a settler family might accumulate in a lifetime. Beneath the furs, the elite wore layered clothing made from wool, silk, and cotton, fabrics that required either extensive trade networks or direct importation. The women wore dresses cut in styles that approximated current European fashion, though always a few years behind and adapted for Siberian conditions with additional layers and modifications for extreme cold. Men wore coats and trousers that signaled their profession and status, military officers in uniform when appropriate, merchants in solid practical clothing that nevertheless showed quality materials and good tailoring, administrators in dress that marked their connection to imperial authority. These clothes were not just covering, but communication, announcing who you were and what position you held in the social hierarchy. Daily schedules for the elite bore little resemblance to the dawn-to-dark labor patterns of frontier settlers. A merchant might wake at a reasonable hour, take breakfast with his family, then proceed to his office or warehouse to conduct business. This business was often the fur trade, Siberia's primary export, and the source of most accumulated wealth in the region. Merchants negotiated with hunters and trappers who brought pelts from the deep forest, assessed quality, arranged transport to distant markets, managed complex credit relationships that stretched across years and thousands of miles. The work required skill and knowledge, certainly, but it was conducted in heated rooms, involved primarily mental rather than physical labor, and offered opportunities for substantial profit. A successful fur merchant could become wealthy by any standard, accumulating resources that would have seemed fictional to the people actually catching the animals whose pelts generated that wealth. Administrative officials, governors, tax collectors, judges, postal administrators maintained the skeletal structures of imperial governance across Siberia's vast distances. Their work was often frustrating, trying to impose bureaucratic order on regions that were barely mapped, recording information about populations who moved frequently and evaded official notice, collecting taxes from people who had little money and many ways to avoid payment. But the work was conducted from positions of relative comfort and authority. An official might complain about the difficulties of Siberian service, the remoteness, the cold, the distance from cultural centers, while living in housing that was luxurious by local standards and exercising power that frontier settlers could never access. The gulf between official understanding of Siberian life and actual conditions was often enormous. Reports sent back to St. Petersburg describe settlements in administrative terms, population counts, agricultural production, tax revenues, that bore only loose relationship to lived reality. Officials who ventured out to inspect frontier settlements returned with stories of hardship that their colleagues in town offices found exaggerated or sensationalized. The bureaucratic apparatus simply lacked frameworks for accurately representing what life was actually like at the margins, so it defaulted to comfortable fictions that made the frontier seem more ordered and manageable than it was. Military officers stationed in Siberian garrisons occupied an interesting social position. They were often minor nobility or ambitious commoners who had chosen military service as a path to advancement, and Siberian postings were generally viewed as punishment or exile rather than opportunity. The conditions were harsh even for officers, winters that made routine duties challenging, isolation from the social and cultural life of Western Russia, limited opportunities for the kind of military glory that advanced careers. Yet compared to common soldiers, and especially compared to frontier settlers, officers lived in considerable comfort. They had heated quarters, regular food supplies provided by military logistics, structured days that included time for leisure and social activities. They hosted dinners, organized balls during winter months, created elaborate social rituals that helped pass the time and maintain the fiction that they were still connected to civilized European society. These social events, dinner parties, balls, theatrical performances, were perhaps the most striking example of elite life's disconnect from frontier reality. While settlers huddled in underground dwellings struggling to survive, wealthy Siberians gathered in ballrooms warmed by multiple stoves, wearing formal clothing, dancing to music performed by small orchestras, engaging in elaborate rituals of courtship and social positioning. The balls followed patterns borrowed from European society, but adapted to Siberian circumstances. They began later in the evening to allow time for travel through dark, cold streets. They featured local delicacies alongside foods that approximated European standards. The dances were familiar forms, waltzes, polonaises, mazurkas, performed with the particular intensity that comes from limited social opportunities. For young people of the elite class, these gatherings were crucial, one of the few contexts where they might meet potential spouses, form social alliances, or simply enjoy themselves in ways their isolated circumstances usually prevented. The balls were both genuine social events and performances of civility, ways of insisting that they remained connected to broader Russian culture despite geographical remoteness. The Orthodox Church maintained a significant presence in Siberian towns, with priests and hierarchs who served populations scattered across enormous distances. Churches themselves were often the most impressive buildings in any settlement, wooden or stone structures with characteristic onion domes, decorated interiors with icons and elaborate liturgical furnishings. The clergy occupied an ambiguous social position. They were educated, commanded religious authority, and lived more comfortably than common people. But they were also expected to serve populations in conditions that could be quite harsh, traveling to remote settlements to perform baptisms, marriages and funerals, maintaining religious practice in circumstances that made regular observation difficult. A dedicated priest might spend weeks traveling between scattered communities, sleeping in rough accommodations, sharing meals with families who had little to share. Yet back in town, that same priest would live in a rectory provided by the church, would dine with merchants and officials, would participate in the same social world as other elite members. He existed simultaneously in both worlds, the world of comfort and the world of hardship, in ways that other elite members generally did not. The educational opportunities available to elite children marked another stark distinction. Frontier settlers' children learned through observation and participation in survival tasks, acquiring practical knowledge that kept them alive but little formal education. Elite children, by contrast, had access to tutors, sometimes educated servants, sometimes dedicated teachers, occasionally foreign specialists who had found their way to Siberia through various unlikely paths. They learned to read and write in Russian, sometimes in French or German as well. They studied mathematics, history, geography, and religious texts. Girls learned music, drawing, and the social accomplishments expected of their class. Boys were prepared for careers in administration, commerce, or military service, given foundations in subjects that would be relevant to those paths. This education was not uniformly excellent. Teachers were often inadequately trained, books were scarce, isolation limited exposure to new ideas, but it existed, creating yet another way elite children's futures differed from those of settler children. Health and medicine provided another measure of the class divide. Elite families had access to doctors, not many, and not always well trained by European standards, but at least professionals with some medical education. These doctors could provide treatments that ranged from genuinely helpful to actively harmful, but their presence meant that illness was approached systematically rather than through folk remedies or desperate improvisation. A merchant's child with fever would be examined by a doctor who might prescribe medicines, adjust diet, recommend specific care. A settler's child with the same fever would be treated with whatever remedies the family knew, prayers and hope, with survival depending far more on the child's constitution and luck than on any effective intervention. Medical care was not equally distributed. Wealthy families could afford better attention and more expensive treatments, but its existence marked a fundamental difference in how health crises were experienced. The rhythm of the seasons affected elite life differently than it affected frontier existence. Winter brought the same cold and darkness to everyone, but for the wealthy, winter was primarily a social season rather than a survival challenge. With outdoor work impossible and travel difficult, the winter months became time for concentrated social activity, the balls and dinners and theatrical performances that filled the calendar. Summer, conversely, was when elite families might travel, visit other towns, conduct business that required movement, or simply enjoy the brief period when Siberia became almost pleasant. For frontier settlers, the seasonal rhythm was reversed. Winter was survival mode, all energy focused on staying alive, while summer was frantic labor trying to produce and store enough to survive the next winter. The same seasons, experienced so differently that they barely seemed to describe the same annual cycle. Yet the elite world was more fragile than it appeared. Wealth in Siberia was often unstable, dependent on trade networks that could be disrupted by politics, weather, or simple bad luck. A merchant who seemed prosperous could be ruined by a failed shipment, a bad debt, or changes in fur prices. Official positions offered security but also required maintaining favor with superiors who were thousands of miles away and might change without warning. Military careers in Siberia rarely led to advancement. Officers who spent too long in remote posts found themselves forgotten when opportunities for promotion arose. The elite lifestyle required constant effort to maintain, constant navigation of relationships and opportunities, constant awareness that their comfortable position was not as secure as it might appear. Moreover, elite life in Siberia carried its own forms of suffering that, while incomparable to frontier hardship, were nevertheless real to those experiencing them. The isolation was profound, being cut off from the cultural and intellectual life of European Russia, from family and friends, from the opportunities and diversions that made life interesting. Letters took months to arrive. News was always old by the time it reached Siberia. Trends and fashions were outdated before they could be adopted. For educated, cultured people, and many members of the Siberian elite were both, this isolation could be psychologically devastating. Women of the elite class faced particular challenges. They were expected to maintain European standards of behavior and appearance in circumstances that made this extraordinarily difficult. They were supposed to manage households, raise children, participate in social life, and embody civilized values while living in a place that seemed fundamentally opposed to civilization. Many found the experience profoundly alienating, spending their Siberian years longing for return to European Russia, measuring their lives in terms of how much longer they must endure before escape became possible. Some adapted more successfully, finding ways to make meaningful lives in Siberian circumstances. They involved themselves in charitable work, though charity in this context often meant providing small assistance to people whose poverty was so extreme that meaningful help was impossible. They pursued artistic or intellectual interests within the constraints of limited resources and audiences. They created social networks that provided genuine connection and support. But even successful adaptation required constant negotiation between the lives they had expected to live and the lives they actually found themselves living. The gap between expectation and reality was itself a form of suffering, less dramatic than physical hardship, but no less real to those experiencing it. The relationship between the elite and the frontier settlers they theoretically governed or employed, or simply coexisted with, was complex and often contradictory. Elite families depended on frontier labor. Settlers grew food that fed towns, provided raw materials, served as servants and workers, made elite lifestyle possible through their toil. Yet the elite often viewed settlers with a mixture of pity and contempt, pity for their obvious hardship, contempt for their poverty and lack of education. Settlers were seen as lesser beings, unfortunate, but also somehow deserving of their circumstances through their own failures or inadequacies. This attitude was not universal or uniformly intense, but it was common enough to shape interactions. An official might genuinely want to improve settlers' conditions while also believing they were fundamentally inferior and incapable of better. A merchant might pay fair prices for goods settlers produced, while also viewing the producers as barely human. A priest might serve frontier communities with dedication, while also believing they were spiritually backward and in need of correction. Settlers, for their part, viewed the elite with resentment mixed with awe. The visible comfort of elite life was both inspiring and infuriating, proof that better existence was possible, but also reminder that such existence was systematically denied to most people. Settlers understood, perhaps more clearly than the elite did, that their hardship and elite comfort were connected, that wealth accumulated in town was extracted from labor performed in brutal conditions at the margins. This understanding rarely led to organized resistance. The mechanisms for such resistance barely existed, but it created an undercurrent of tension in all interactions between classes. The power relationships were obviously asymmetrical. Elite members could make decisions that profoundly affected settlers' lives, setting tax rates, determining land allocation, adjudicating disputes, controlling access to markets. Settlers had little recourse when these decisions went against them, no meaningful way to appeal or resist beyond the passive resistance of evasion and non-compliance. The system was not exactly feudal. Settlers were not serfs, they had some legal rights. The relationship was mediated through official structures rather than personal bonds, but it was deeply hierarchical and offered little protection for those at the bottom. Yet the system also required some level of mutual accommodation. Elites needed settlers to remain alive and productive, which meant not pushing extraction so far that populations collapsed or fled. Settlers needed at least some connection to official structures and market systems, which meant maintaining some level of cooperation with elite-controlled institutions. The result was an uneasy equilibrium where both groups recognized their mutual dependence while also resenting it. The physical geography of Siberian towns reflected these social divisions. Elite families lived in the center, near administrative buildings and churches, in substantial houses with enclosed yards. Workers, servants, and poorer residents lived in outer districts in smaller structures that were closer to zemlyanki than to proper houses. Frontier settlers visiting town would stay in these outer areas, in cheap lodging or with relatives, rarely entering the central districts except for specific purposes, selling goods, settling legal matters, attending church on major holidays. The town's layout made social hierarchy visible and reinforced it through daily experience. You could read someone's status by where they lived, which streets they walked, which establishments they entered. This spatial organization was not rigidly enforced. There were no laws prohibiting settlers from central areas, but social pressure and practical necessity maintained it effectively. A frontier settler in rough clothes would feel profoundly out of place in Merchants' District, and that feeling of displacement served to keep boundaries intact without requiring explicit policing. Markets were one of the few spaces where classes mixed with some regularity. Settlers brought produce, furs, and other goods to sell. Elite members or their servants came to buy. The market was regulated, officials set prices, collected fees, monitored for fraud, but it was also chaotic, noisy, a place where social rules were somewhat relaxed. Conversations happened across class lines in markets that would never occur in other contexts. A merchant's wife might chat with a settler woman about vegetable quality, establishing momentary human connection that existed outside the usual hierarchical frameworks. But these moments of connection were fleeting and did not fundamentally alter power relationships. Winter transformed towns just as it transformed frontier settlements, though in different ways. The cold was still severe, darkness still profound, isolation still intense. But town residents had resources to manage these challenges. Substantial buildings held heat, stored food was more diverse and reliable, social activities provided distraction and structure. The winter months in town could even be pleasant, in their way, a time of concentrated social life, of gathering with others around fires and samovars, of creating artificial warmth and light to push back against the natural darkness. Yet, even for the elite, winter carried psychological weight. The months of darkness and cold wore on everyone, creating a kind of seasonal melancholy that was widely recognized. Letters from Siberian officials to friends in European Russia often described this feeling. The way winter seemed to last forever, the way darkness affected mood and energy, the way isolation became almost unbearable by late winter, even when physical comfort was assured. The contrast with frontier settlers' experience was that elite winter melancholy was psychological and social, while settler winter suffering was physical and existential, but both were real forms of hardship created by the same seasonal extremes. Spring's arrival was celebrated in town with the same relief felt in settlements, though expressed differently. Churches held services of thanksgiving, social events increased, people emerged from winter hibernation with genuine joy. The first warm days were occasions for excursions outside town, for examining gardens and planning improvements, for feeling that life had returned after months of suspension. These celebrations had a performative quality, rituals that expressed collective relief while also reinforcing social bonds and shared cultural identity. The question of whether elite Siberians understood the conditions frontier settlers lived under is difficult to answer simply. Some had genuine knowledge born of direct observation, priests who traveled to remote settlements, officials who conducted inspections, merchants who dealt directly with trappers and hunters. These individuals understood that frontier life was harsh in ways that reports and descriptions could not fully capture. They had seen Zemlyanki, had watched people struggle with basic survival, had witnessed the physical toll extreme conditions took on human bodies. But understanding did not necessarily translate into action or even sympathy. One could understand that settlers lived in terrible conditions while also believing those conditions were inevitable or deserved, or simply not one's responsibility to address. The gap between knowledge and caring was wide, maintained by social ideologies that naturalized inequality and by simple self-interest that discouraged too much empathy for for those whose labor supported one's own comfort. Most elite members had only vague, second-hand understanding of frontier life. They knew it was difficult in general terms, but lacked specific knowledge of what difficulty actually meant in daily practice. This allowed them to maintain comfortable fictions, that settlers were adequately provided for, that hardship built character, that conditions were improving through gradual progress, that the system as a whole was essentially fair and reasonable. These fictions were necessary psychological defenses, ways of avoiding the moral implications of their own comfortable lives. To truly understand and acknowledge frontier suffering would require confronting uncomfortable questions about justice, about the distribution of resources, about their own complicity in maintaining systems that concentrated comfort for some through the hardship of others. Most elite Siberians preferred not to confront these questions, and the physical and social distance between town and frontier made it easy to avoid them. The two worlds coexisted in the same landscape, under the same sky, subject to the same winter cold. But they remained separate in crucial ways. Different architectures, different daily rhythms, different relationships to survival and comfort, different futures available to children born into each world. The separation was maintained through wealth, power, and social structures that made inequality seem natural and inevitable rather than constructed and contestable. Yet, the separation was never complete. Elite comfort depended absolutely on frontier labor, the food that fed towns, the furs that generated wealth, the timber that built houses, the simple fact of settlement that allowed Siberia to be incorporated into Russian imperial structures. Frontier settlers, for their part, existed within systems shaped by elite decisions and needs, land allocation, tax requirements, market access, legal frameworks. The two worlds were mutually constitutive even as they remained experientially distinct, each necessary to the other even as they remained profoundly unequal. This was the fundamental paradox of Siberian society in the period of frontier settlement, a world divided between underground and above ground, between survival and comfort, between those whose daily effort went towards simply continuing to live and those whose lives offered possibilities beyond mere survival. Both groups inhabited the same winter, but they inhabited it from such different positions that they might as well have been in different worlds entirely, their experiences of the same season bearing so little resemblance that they could barely be compared. And so we come to the end of our journey through frozen ground and frozen time, having walked alongside those who made their homes beneath the surface of the earth, who carved survival from conditions that seem almost unimaginable from our present comfort. Let us rest here for a moment, in this quiet space between then and now, and consider what these stories reveal about human endurance, adaptation, and the strange ways we make meaning from hardship. The Siberian frontier settlers who lived in Zemlyanki were not heroes in any conventional sense, nor were they victims in need of rescue. They were simply people confronting circumstances that demanded everything they could give, and they responded with the resources available to them, borrowed knowledge from indigenous neighbors, imported techniques from their Russian heritage, innovations born from necessity, and above all, an extraordinary capacity for repetitive endurance that rarely receives recognition because it is not dramatic or remarkable in individual moments. Heroism, we tend to think, involves exceptional acts performed in extraordinary circumstances. But perhaps there is another kind of heroism in the simply continuing, in waking each morning into darkness and cold, in performing the same survival tasks day after day for months and years and decades, in maintaining dignity and humanity when conditions seem designed to strip both away, in raising children with gentleness, even when gentleness was a luxury you could barely afford. This quieter heroism leaves no monuments, inspires no epic poems, rarely even makes it into historical records. It is the heroism of Maria Sidorovna and thousands like her, people whose names we barely know, but whose collective effort literally built the world, settlement by settlement, winter by winter, one day's survival following another until those days accumulated into lifetimes. The underground dwellings themselves, those mysterious structures with their puzzling ventilation systems and ambiguous purposes, remind us that we can never fully recover the past, never completely understand what life felt like to those who lived it. The archaeology gives us fragments, traces, evidence of presence but not of consciousness. We can see the smoke channels they built but cannot fully grasp the logic that shaped those designs. We can recover their tools and dishes but cannot taste the meals they prepared or feel the particular cold of their winters or understand the texture of their daily experience. This incompleteness is not a failure of scholarship, but a fundamental condition of historical understanding. The past exists in the traces it leaves, but those traces are always partial, always requiring interpretation, always leaving spaces that cannot be filled. The mysteries surrounding the Zemlyanki, the unexplained architectural features, the ambiguous artifacts, the cultural practices that left material evidence but not clear meanings, these mysteries are appropriate in their way. They honor the complexity and particularity of lives lived outside the systems that typically preserve and transmit cultural memory. The elite world we examined, that realm of heated houses and formal balls, of tea in samovars and imported luxuries, existed simultaneously with frontier suffering and was made possible by it. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth our journey has revealed, that comfort and hardship are not separate phenomena, but connected aspects of the same social systems. The warmth of a merchant's house was paid for, in part, by the labor of people freezing in underground dwellings. The elaborate social rituals of town life were sustained by extraction from those who had almost nothing to give. This does not mean the elite were villains or the settlers were saints, moral categories that simply rarely fit historical realities. It means that social systems distribute resources and hardships unequally, that some people's possibilities depend on other people's constraints, that privilege and deprivation exist in relationship rather than isolation. The elite Siberians experienced their own forms of suffering, isolation, psychological strain, the weight of living in conditions that, while incomparably better than frontier circumstances, were still harsh by the standards of European Russian society they had left behind. These sufferings were real to those experiencing them, even if they were categorically different from the sufferings of underground settlers. The capacity to recognize both kinds of hardship without equating them, to acknowledge that systems can harm everyone involved while harming some far more than others, to maintain this complexity rather than collapsing into simple moral narratives. This is part of what historical study teaches us, if we let it. What strikes most powerfully, perhaps, as we prepare to leave this frozen world behind, is the sheer endurance these lives required. Not the endurance of a single crisis survived or a dramatic challenge overcome, but the endurance of unending repetition, winter following winter, following winter, each one requiring the same exhausting effort, the same constant vigilance, the same suppression of comfort and hope. The rhythm of those lives was so different from the rhythms most of us inhabit now, in our climate-controlled environments where seasons affect us primarily aesthetically rather than existentially. We can barely imagine what it meant to know with absolute certainty that winter was coming and would last for months, and might kill you if you made mistakes, or even if you didn't make mistakes, but simply encountered bad luck. We can barely conceive of daily life spent almost entirely underground, in spaces so dark that most activities happened by feel rather than sight, in cold that never fully left even when fires were burning, in air thick with smoke because adequate ventilation was impossible to achieve. The sensory deprivation alone would be overwhelming by contemporary standards: the lack of light, the narrowness of space, the absence of privacy, the constant presence of earth pressing close on all sides. Yet people lived entire lifetimes in these conditions. They fell in love, raised children, told stories, laughed, argued, dreamed, maintained their humanity in circumstances that seemed calculated to crush it. This is both humbling and strangely encouraging. Humbling because it shows how soft our own lives are by comparison, how little hardship most of us actually face despite our tendency to perceive our own struggles as significant. Encouraging because it demonstrates the extraordinary adaptability and resilience humans possess when circumstances demand it. The settlers did not merely survive, though survival itself was an achievement. They also adapted, creating new cultural forms that blended Russian and indigenous traditions, developing architectural innovations that solved problems their ancestors had never faced, maintaining social bonds and collective memory in conditions of extreme isolation. They found ways to make meaning even in lives that seemed defined by meaningless repetition. They created dignities out of nothing, maintained hopes that reason suggested were foolish, persisted because the alternative was unthinkable. As we emerge from these underground spaces, as we leave behind the world of Maria Sidorovna and her nameless neighbors, we carry with us certain recognitions. We understand, perhaps more clearly than before, that comfort is not a given, but an achievement maintained through countless systems and labors that usually remain invisible. We recognize that the physical circumstances of life profoundly shape what kinds of experiences and possibilities are available to people, that architecture is not neutral, but creates and constrains ways of being human. We see that hardship can be chronic rather than acute, grinding rather than dramatic, and that this grinding hardship requires its own kind of courage that rarely receives acknowledgement. We might also carry a new appreciation for the simple facts of our own existence, the light that comes from switches, the heat that flows from vents, the food that appears in markets without requiring months of anxious preparation, the medical care available when illness strikes, the leisure time we possess to pursue interests beyond mere survival. These are not universal human conditions, but specific historical achievements, unevenly distributed now as they were then. The Siberian frontier settlers' experiences remind us that most humans throughout history have lived closer to their conditions than to ours, that what we consider normal, comfort, security, predictability, would seem miraculous to people like Maria Sidorovna. This recognition need not produce guilt exactly, but perhaps a certain humility, a certain gratitude, a certain awareness that our own circumstances are contingent rather than natural or inevitable. The underground world we have explored exists now only as traces, archaeological sites being slowly excavated, historical records that barely mention the lives we have imagined, oral histories collected generations after the fact and filtered through many retellings. The actual Zemlyanki have mostly collapsed, their logs rotting back into the earth they were carved from, their carefully designed ventilation systems filling with soil, their hearths growing cold forever. The people who lived in them are gone entirely, their bodies returned to the ground they spent their lives trying to rise above. Their names, with rare exceptions like Maria Sidorovna, and even she is more composite than individual, have been lost to time. Their particular struggles, their private sorrows and small joys, their daily thoughts as they hauled water, or tended fires, or lay in darkness waiting for sleep. All of this has vanished as completely as winter snow melting into spring ground. What remains are patterns, generalities, the broad outlines of lives lived, rather than the texture of consciousness that animated those lives. This is melancholy in its way, this recognition that even lives lived with such intensity and difficulty leave so little trace. But there is also something peaceful in it, a reminder that our own struggles, our own anxieties, our own sense of our lives' importance will also fade, will also be absorbed into larger patterns, will also become mere traces, for future observers to interpret and misinterpret. The settlers' lives were not tragic in any cosmic sense. They were simply difficult, and the people living them did what people do. They adapted, endured, found what meaning they could, and eventually died, making room for others who would repeat the same patterns with minor variations until circumstances finally changed enough that underground dwelling was no longer necessary. That change, when it came slowly. As Siberia developed, as towns grew, as transportation improved, and resources became more available, the need for zemlyanki gradually diminished. By the late 19th century, most settlers were building proper above-ground houses, using the underground only for storage. By the early 20th century, the zemlyanka had become primarily a historical curiosity rather than a living architectural tradition. The knowledge of how to build them well, the accumulated wisdom about managing underground life, this faded as it was no longer needed, preserved only imperfectly in memory and not at all in official records. Now, in our present moment, as we prepare to leave this historical space and return to our own time, we might take a moment to appreciate the warmth around us. If you are listening to this in a comfortable room, feel the air against your skin, notice its temperature, recognize that this warmth is not struggling against cold, but simply existing reliably without your conscious effort. If there is light in your space, observe it, how it fills the room, how it makes objects visible, how it changes the quality of space. Light that comes without needing to be carefully rationed, light abundant enough that you barely notice it. If you have recently eaten, remember the taste, remember the ease with which food appeared. Remember that you did not have to wonder whether there would be enough to last until spring. These simple facts of contemporary life would have seemed like impossible luxury to the people we have been walking alongside. The distance between their world and ours is not merely temporal, not just the passage of years and decades. It is a distance of experience, of possibility, of relationship to basic survival. We live in such different circumstances that their daily reality is almost foreign to us, requiring conscious effort to imagine. Yet they were humans like us, with the same basic capacities and needs, experiencing joy and sorrow and boredom and hope in ways that, despite all differences, connect us across time. Perhaps the most important thing we can take from this journey is not specific historical knowledge, though that has its value, but a renewed sense of the remarkable flexibility and endurance of human consciousness. People can adapt to almost anything, can find ways to be human in circumstances that seem designed to prevent humanity, can create meaning and dignity and connection in the most unlikely contexts. This is both sobering and encouraging. Sobering because it means humans can be forced to endure terrible conditions and will somehow manage it. Encouraging because it means we possess depths of resilience we rarely have occasion to discover. The settlers who lived underground for months at a time probably did not know before they tried it whether they could survive such conditions. They discovered their own capacity for endurance through the act of enduring, learned what they were capable of by being forced to become capable of it. Most of them would surely have preferred easier lives, who wouldn't? But since easier lives were not available, they lived the lives they had with whatever grace and strength they could muster. As we let this story settle into the background of our consciousness, as we allow ourselves to drift away from frozen Siberia and back toward our own warm spaces and soft beds, we might carry with us a quiet recognition of the enormous effort that survival has required across most of human history. We are the beneficiaries of systems and technologies and social arrangements that have made life incomparably easier than it was for our ancestors. This ease is recent, fragile, and unevenly distributed. There are still people in our present moment whose daily struggles resemble frontier settler hardships more closely than they resemble our own comfortable circumstances. But for those of us fortunate enough to live in comfort, there is value in occasionally remembering what comfort actually means, what it represents, what enormous distance separates our daily experience from the daily experience of most humans who have ever lived. The underground world of Siberian frontier settlements is gone now, surviving only in archaeological traces and historical imagination. The people who inhabited that world are gone too, their particular consciousnesses extinguished as completely as their fires. But we can still, with effort, reach across time and try to understand what that world was like, what it demanded, how people responded to its demands. This reaching is what historical consciousness means, not just knowing facts about the past, but trying to feel, however imperfectly, what it was like to live in times and places very different from our own. The effort is always incomplete, always mediated by our own perspectives and circumstances, always limited by the fragmentary nature of evidence. But the effort itself has value, creating connections across time, reminding us that our own moment is not universal or eternal, but one particular configuration of human possibility among countless others. And now, as this journey draws to its close, as the voices of the past fade back into silence and the underground dwellings return to the earth that always surrounded them, let yourself rest. You have traveled far tonight, through cold landscapes and difficult times, through lives lived at the edge of endurance. You have seen how people survived when survival seemed impossible, how they maintained humanity in inhuman conditions, how they continued day after day through winters that seemed endless. You have glimpsed both the hardship of underground existence and the equally real, if different, hardship of elite isolation, have understood something about how social systems create comfort for some through the deprivation of others. These are heavy knowings in their way, but you need not carry them into sleep. Let them settle quietly in your mind, becoming part of your understanding without weighing on your rest. As you lie in your own comfortable space, so much warmer, so much lighter, so much softer than any Zemlyanka, feel gratitude if you can, but feel also the simple peace of being here, now, in this moment that is yours. The past we have explored is finished, its struggles complete, its winters finally ended in the permanent spring of historical distance. The settlers who endured those winters have long since found their rest, their bodies returned to the Siberian earth, their consciousness dispersed into the great silence that waits beyond all living. They are at peace now in a way they rarely were during their difficult lives, and we can honor their memory by accepting the peace available to us. Let your breathing slow, matching the rhythm of accumulating snow, soft, steady, unrushed. Let your body sink into whatever holds it, accepting support the way frozen ground accepted the weight of Zemlyanki roofs. Let your mind release its hold on these stories, these images, these difficult knowings, allowing them to drift away like smoke through carefully designed ventilation channels, dissipating into darkness. The past is far away now, and you are here, safe, warm, carried towards sleep by the simple fact of your own breathing. The rhythm of your breath becomes the rhythm of seasons, turning, winter yielding eventually to spring, cold giving way to warmth, darkness accepting light. But for now, in this moment, there is only the gentle descent into rest, the quiet closing of consciousness, the soft embrace of sleep waiting to receive you. Let yourself go now. The journey is complete. The stories have been told. The underground world has released you back into your own time and place. There is nothing more you need to do, nowhere else you need to go, no effort required except the simple allowing of sleep to come. And it will come, gentle and inevitable as spring, carrying you down into depths more comfortable than any Zemlyanka, into darkness that is restful rather than oppressive, into a silence that heals rather than isolates. Sleep well, traveler. The past is settled, the present is quiet, and tomorrow, that distant tomorrow, will take care of itself. For now there is only this: the soft giving way, the gentle release, the peaceful descent into dreams or dreamless rest, whichever finds you first. The winter is over. Spring has come, not to frozen Siberia, but to you, here, now, in the warmth and safety of your own resting place. Let the last of the cold melt away. Let the darkness become simply the natural darkness of closed eyes rather than the darkness of underground dwelling. Let yourself rest as completely as those long-ago settlers finally rested when their struggles ended, as peacefully as snow settling on quiet ground. Good night. Sleep deeply. The stories will keep until you need them again. And for now, there is only rest and warmth and the gentle letting go of consciousness into the soft embrace of sleep.